The girl left her friend's house and disappeared without a trace. The police immediately began to look for her, but she seemed to fall into the ground. The next day, the detectives asked for the security tapes, and what they were expecting shocked everyone. Friends, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's very important for me. Carly Brucia was born on March 16, 1992 in Sarasota, Florida. When the girl was little, her parents divorced, and Carly had to live with her mother. Her father moved to New York City, but despite the distance, she and her daughter were in constant contact, and the girl flew to him almost every weekend and holidays. Her mother married another man who became Carly's stepfather. She also had a younger brother with whom she was very close. Carly was very positive, cheerful, and had many friends. On January 31, 2004, when she was 11 years old, she stayed at her friend's house. They had fun, and the next day, Sunday, Carly was going home. In the evening, the final of the American Football Championship was to be broadcast on television, and the girl wanted to watch it with her family. She was usually picked up by her mother or stepfather, but that evening they were both busy. Then Carly decided to walk. The street was still bright, and her house was a little more than a kilometer away. She left her friend's house at about 6:15 p.m. after telling her friend's parents that she was allowed to go alone. When the girl left, the woman decided to make sure and called her mother. But she said that she did not allow her to walk. Then she decided to ask her husband, Stephen, to drive there and pick up the girl halfway. He got in the car and drove along the road that led to their house. But the girl was nowhere. His stepfather had visited the area several times, but had never been able to find it. Stephen told his wife about it, and she started to worry. The road leading from Carly's girlfriend to their house was almost straight, and the girl could hardly have gone any other way. The woman called all her friends who lived in the area. She speculated that Carly might have visited someone else, but no one saw the girl that night. She and her stepfather waited a little longer, hoping that the girl would still come home. But at about 8:30, my mother decided to call the police. The officers immediately began searching, concentrating their efforts along the girl's route. They talked to shop and cafe workers, knocked on apartment buildings, and tried to find anyone who saw her. Meanwhile, the police also searched every alley, inspecting the local park, but they could not find Carly. The search continued all night. The officers established that none of the friends and acquaintances had seen the girl that night. They also failed to find any witnesses. The police immediately began to look at her stepfather as a possible suspect. He was supposed to be on the same street as Carly, and in theory, he could have kidnapped her. But the man said he called his wife almost as soon as he got there, and they were on the phone the whole time he was out looking for the girl. The woman confirmed it, and investigators began to doubt that he could have done it. Stephen told the police something interesting. When the man was driving down the street looking for the girl, he noticed a red pickup several times, which also went in different directions on this section of the road. Later, when he arrived at his friend Carly's house, he saw the car in front of him. It turned out that it belonged to the stepfather of this friend named Ron. The detectives wondered if he had anything to do with her disappearance, and soon they had another serious suspicion. The next morning, they brought the search dogs to the scene. They were given to sniff Carly's things, and they caught her scent along the road from her friend's house. But then something strange began. The dogs led the detectives to the car wash, which was almost in the middle of the way. The girl's trail ended on the edge of the parking lot. The police immediately realized that Carly could have walked through the car wash to turn to a private road and cut her way to her house a bit. But the fact that the dogs lost her scent behind the car wash made the detectives wonder. They've cordoned off the place and started looking for possible leads. The owner of the car wash said he had motion detector cameras and handed over to the police the footage from last day. And here the detective saw something really creepy. One of the cameras in the back of the car wash was filming Carly passing there at 6:20, 1 p.m. Everything was normal when suddenly a man came out to meet the girl. He approached her and immediately grabbed her by the hand. Apparently, he told her something for several seconds. Then he took her out of sight of the camera. These shots really shocked the investigators. They understood that with a high probability the camera caught the moment of the girl's abduction. The detectives also suggested that an unidentified man could threaten Carly to go with him. The video shows him putting his hand in his pocket. Maybe he threatened her with some kind of weapon if she tried to escape. The main task for the police was to identify this man, and then they remembered Ron, the stepfather of Carly's girlfriend, in a red pickup truck. Despite the poor quality of the camera footage, they concluded that he looked like that unknown person. What's more, Stephen told them that the pickup truck was driving into the car wash grounds, which was even more suspicious. Ron was called in for questioning, but denied any involvement. The man said that after Carly's mum started to worry, he also decided to go on a quest. He and his wife were worried that the girl had left their home without their mother's permission and wanted to help with the search. Regarding the security footage, Ron stated that he had not yet left work at 6:21 p.m. The police interviewed his colleagues, and all confirmed that the men had indeed left after that time. The detectives asked for permission to search his van, and Ron agreed. No trace of the girl was found, and the police concluded that the man was telling them the truth. As a result, the investigators returned to their starting point. They threw everything at identifying this man from the video. They immediately noticed his clothing. It looked like a work uniform, and the man had on his chest some sort of badge or patch. Experts tried to improve the quality of the record and try to read what it says, but they never succeeded. All they could do was assume there was a 3-letter name on the name tag. In addition, tattoos were visible on the man's body, but the pattern could not be counted due to the poor quality of the recording. The detectives sent the footage out to TV channels and newspapers hoping that someone would recognize the man. Within a few hours, the recording had spread throughout the city. Hundreds of calls had begun to be made to the police. People were telling them they knew people they knew, and detectives were documenting every single tip. The situation was complicated by the fact that the quality of the recording made it impossible to see the suspect's face. Because of this, a lot of people shared their hunches about who it might be, but the vast majority of them were absolutely unsure of this. This went on for almost 24 hours, until in the morning of 3 February, detectives noticed one specific call. A man named Ed said he was 100% sure the man in the footage is his former colleague, Joseph Smith. He recognized him by his gait, build, hairstyle, and clothing. Smith worked as a car mechanic. The police immediately began to make inquiries about this man. Joseph, who was 37 years old, had 3 children but did not live with them because he divorced his wife. The man also had an impressive criminal history. He was arrested more than 10 times on various charges, from illegal substances to kidnapping and holding people against their will. Smith was currently on probation. However, a year earlier, the man had violated his parole twice, but for some reason he had not been sent back to prison. The police also discovered that Smith owned a brown Lincoln and decided to re-examine the security footage. However, they were unable to locate him in the area of the abduction of the girl. However, they noticed another car that had come to the site several times. A light Buick would drive into the car wash parking lot just 3 minutes before Carly was abducted. Unfortunately, due to the quality of the image, the investigators could not see any important detail. Although Smith's car was not seen in the area, the police decided to check it out. The man rented a room at the home of an elderly couple, and the detectives went to him. First, they watched the house and found that the owners were not there, and Smith was his own room. However, when they knocked on the door, no one opened the door. The police called the officer in charge of Joseph's parole and waited. About 45 minutes later, Smith's sister drove up to the house, and she took her brother to the house, and she took her brother to the detective. The man said he had nothing to do with the kidnapping, and he was far from that area that day. When he was shown the surveillance footage, Smith admitted that the man in the photo did look like him, but it wasn't him. The man also allowed investigators to search his room and car without a warrant. In the room, they found several sets of grey mechanic uniforms, similar to those on the kidnapper. The patch also had a 3-letter abbreviation, Joe. As we recall, the experts were able to establish that the kidnapper also had a 3-letter name on his chest. However, no significant evidence was found in the room. While the police were searching, the hostess returned home. She said the man was actually home at about 6:30 p.m. because he used a landline to talk to his ex-wife, so Joseph had a solid alibi. However, during a search of his car, the police discovered 2 spoons that were apparently used to heat up illegal substances. Considering it was a violation of his parole, Smith was arrested and taken to the station. After this, the detectives began to examine other possible suspects, but later that evening, something unexpected happened. The husband of the mistress of the house in which Joseph rented a room came to the police station. The man said his wife had some memory problems and she accidentally gave the police false information. In fact, on the day of his abduction, Smith left his home around 3:00 am and returned at 7:00 the next morning. It is noteworthy that at that moment, it had on the working form of mechanics. Not only did Joseph not have an alibi for the abduction, he also lied to the cops that he was home. However, this was not the most interesting thing. Before leaving the house, Smith borrowed the owner's car, a light Buick. The same guy who stopped by the car was 3 minutes before the kidnapping. The owner of the house added that when Joseph returned his car, there was a real mess inside. The man moved the seats, moved the things, and didn't explain why he did it. With that in mind, Joseph was immediately the prime suspect and the police brought him in for questioning. However, the man refused to speak without his lawyer. The investigators sent him back to the prison, where he was being held for parole violations. The next day, his brother John came to the police station, and the detectives were expecting something interesting. The man said that he had had little contact with his brother in recent years, but Joseph called him on the evening of 1 February. The man refused to talk to him, but a few hours later he arrived at his house. Apparently, Joseph was under the influence of some powerful substances, and his brother kicked him out. He later saw the kidnapping footage on the news and immediately realized that his brother was on it. Detectives asked John to help them get a confession, and the man agreed. He visited him in prison with his mother, and the brothers spoke for about an hour and a half. However, when John got out of there, he said that Joseph had never confessed, and he kept insisting that he had nothing to do with the crime. The detectives suspected that the brother and his mother might have been keeping something from them. John said that he recognized his brother from the news video, but that he did not share that information with the police until a few days later. Eventually, the investigators decided to follow him, and soon it paid off. Apparently, John noticed the surveillance and thought the detectives were also tapping his phone. They didn't actually do it. However, he did not know. The next night, he called the police and said that his brother had actually confessed to him and his mother. Joseph said he wasn't sure if he killed the girl, but that was the most obvious option. His brother managed to convince him to tell him where he had left Carly, and Joseph said that he had abandoned her near the local church. John and Mum went there, but they never found anything. They had hoped to the last that their relative was not really involved, so they decided to see for themselves before telling the investigators. The police immediately drove to this church, and in the trees near it, they found Carly's body. She was partially missing clothing, and it was clear that the victim had been dead for several days. Meanwhile, the detectives heard from John everything his brother had told him in prison. According to the suspect, he took illegal substances that day, and everything was a blur. He admitted that he had abducted the girl, assaulted her in a car, and then allegedly strangled her. Medical examiners confirmed that the victim was indeed strangled to death. Meanwhile, Kesu was looking into the evidence in the Buick that Joseph borrowed from the landlord. They found several of Carly's hair, as well as 7 pieces of tissue that matched the material on the girl's shirt that night. In addition, there were semen traces on this t-shirt, and DNA analysis showed it belonged to Joseph Smith. All this was enough to charge him with murder. However, despite the confession of his brother and mother, the man again pleaded not guilty, and the case was brought to court. The trial began in November 2005, almost 2 years after the murder. The defense failed to provide any evidence to support the client's innocence. The prosecution, on the other hand, had ample evidence: the surveillance tapes, the alibi lies, the DNA on the victim's body, and the fact that he named her whereabouts made his guilt clear. The trial was swift, and Joseph Smith was found guilty. On 15 March 2006, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and abuse. And for Carly's murder, the man was sentenced to death. Joseph Smith has since been in prison awaiting execution, but the sentence was quashed 13 years later in July 2017. The reason for this was the new law, according to which a unanimous verdict by a jury was necessary for the imposition of the death penalty. In the case of Joseph, 10 out of 12 voted in favor. The man remained in prison to serve his life sentence, but in April 2020, the court reversed his sentence and returned the death penalty, but Joseph never received the execution. On 26 July 2021, he died in prison at the age of 55. Despite his death, there are still questions in the Joseph Smith case. After his imprisonment, the detectives began to think that he might be involved in other murders. While investigating the matter, they concluded that he had killed a young girl in 2000, whose case had not yet been solved. Even his brother said he suspected Joseph of the crime. The police may one day find evidence that links him to this murder, but it remains unsolved. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and be sure to like under this clip if you like it. I also recommend subscribing to our channel, where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thank you for watching. In a typical winter morning, the police department of a small town received 2 alarming calls. The officers went to the house at the given address, where they were waiting for a shocking picture. What happened next resembled the plot of a detective thriller, and it took 7 years to solve this terrible story. Only after all this time, the truth became known to everyone, but not everyone was ready for such an outcome. Friends, after viewing, I recommend to subscribe to my channel and also to like. It is very important for me. Connie Dade was born on July 31, 1976 in the small American town of Ellington, Connecticut. Her parents also had 2 daughters and a brother. From an early age, the girl was distinguished for her kindness and desire to help people, so she had many friends. Because of these qualities, Connie decided to pursue a medical degree. She graduated from the University of Connecticut and then joined the sales department of a pharmaceutical company. In addition, Connie became vice president of her city's charity, which provided free emergency medical care. The girl also wanted to create a large and friendly family. At the beginning of the Zero, she had this opportunity. She met a man named Richard, and they began an affair. The couple married on July 4, 2003, and a few years later they had a son. 3 years later, a second boy appeared in the family. Around the same time, Connie and Richard decided to get a new home. They bought a large house in a quiet area on the outskirts of Ellington, and the family moved there. This place was an ideal choice for a large family. In addition to being very spacious, their sons could play in the large backyard. In addition, close friends of Richard and Connie lived in the same area and spent time together with their families. For many years, they lived an exemplary life, but on December 23, 2015, everything changed. This morning, the police department received 2 calls at once. First, the security company called and told them that Richard and Connie's house had been set off by an alarm. 5 minutes later, Richard called the police and asked for help. The officers immediately came to the house, where they were waiting for a terrible picture. One of them went inside through the open front door and immediately saw a trail of blood leading towards the kitchen from the staircase to the basement. The policeman proceeded to the kitchen, where he found Richard. The man was partially tied to an overturned chair with braces and lying face down on the floor. Wounds were seen on his body, and the man had another plastic tie around his neck. The officer called out to him, and Richard answered with one sentence: "He is still in the house." The police immediately requested help and began to search both the building and the entire area. Immediately after that, they were waiting for another terrible find. Going down to the basement, they saw their Connie's body, next to which there was a gun. Meanwhile, the detectives released Richard, and while they waited for the ambulance, the man told them what had happened. This morning about 8:10, he took his sons to a bus stop from which they left for school, before returning home. There he changed into his office clothes, got in his car, and went to work. Meanwhile, Connie was going to a sports class at a local charity gym. Shortly after Richard left the house, he received a security alert from the security company about the alarm in his house. It wasn't the first time this happened, and the reason was their cat, which they left at home alone. The man also realized that he had forgotten to take his laptop, which he needed for work, so he decided to come back. Before he turned around, he texted his supervisor that he was going to be late and back. Richard returned to the house between 8:45 and 9:00 a.m. Entering the house, he heard a noise on the second floor. He went upstairs to Connie's bedroom and, to his horror, saw an unknown man rummaging through their closet. The man was wearing camouflage clothes and his face was covered. As soon as the criminal saw Richard, he attacked him and pushed him to the floor. The unsub then demanded to be given his wallet, bank cards and PIN codes. Otherwise, he threatened to wait for his family to return home and kill him. Almost immediately afterwards, Richard heard the garage door open. Apparently, Connie came home early from her class. The man shouted that there was someone in the house and told her to run. The criminal headed downstairs, but Richard tried to stop him. During the struggle, an unknown man pushed him down the stairs and Richard flew to the first floor. While he was recovering, Connie ran to the basement, where they kept 2 guns, and the perp followed her. A few moments later, Richard was able to get up and also went into the basement. But when he got down there, an unknown man was holding a gun, and the next second he shot Connie. The sound of the shot was so loud that Richard was almost deaf for a few minutes. He thought he heard a second clap soon, but was not sure. The criminal then forced Richard to sit on a chair and tied his arm and leg to it with plastic ties. He then laid down the gun, took the wire cutters lying in the basement, and inflicted several stab wounds on the man with their blade. Then the unsub dumped some things on the floor, took a gas burner, and started burning them. Apparently, he was trying to get rid of the evidence. He turned to Richard and pointed the torch at him. Because Richard was only partially tied to the chair, he managed to get up and dislodge the burner from the attacker's hand. Richard picked it up and pointed it at him, hiding a mask on his face. The criminal, who remained unarmed, immediately ran out of the basement. Shortly after, Richard went upstairs to call the police. While the man was talking about the incident, the police searched the house and the area several kilometers away, but they never found the suspect. The only thing they found was Richard's wallet lying on the front lawn. Investigators have called in canine dogs to try to pick up the trail of the killer. They gave them a sniff of the purse because the perp had been holding it for some time, but it didn't work because 3 different dogs kept bringing detectives back to Richard. After this, the canine dog led the dogs around the house, hoping that they could smell a stranger, but it also did not bring results. This seemed strange to detectives. Trained dogs are able to detect the presence of people even after a few days. But in this case, not one of the 3 dogs could smell anything. Another strange moment was the time frame of what happened. According to Richard, it was about 5 minutes between the time he entered the house and the time the perp escaped. Given that the men returned home between 8:40 and 9:00 a.m., it should have been over no later than 9:05. However, the security company did not inform the police of the alarm at the house until 10 or 16 a.m. And a few minutes after that, Richard himself called. It turned out that he was in the house for more than an hour before going to the police. Besides, there wasn't much time between Connie going to sports and coming home. In the meantime, the man was taken to hospital and doctors determined that all the wounds he had received were not life-threatening. There, the detectives interviewed him again, hoping to get a description of the attacker. Richard said he was tall and big, but because of the mask, it was impossible to see his face. Medical examiners examined Connie's body and determined that she had received 2 bullet wounds, one to the abdomen and one to the back of the head. The detectives had virtually no leads, and they kept talking to Richard, hoping to get more details. The more questions they asked, the more suspicious the answers were. Originally, the man said that he left his house for work while Connie was going to practice, but at the hospital, he said he couldn't remember exactly which one left first. He also did not remember whether his wife had set the alarm before leaving or not. Richard also changed his version of the incident. Initially, he said he heard a noise on the second floor as soon as he entered the house, but now he said that there was no noise, and he only noticed the criminal when he went upstairs and entered the bedroom. The man also said that the perp did not push him down the stairs of the second floor, and he himself stumbled and fell, but the main inconsistency was related to the time of the murder. Richard said he ran into the basement and saw the perp take Connie's gun, then shoot her. However, he initially said he did not know how the assailant got hold of the gun. Besides, according to the man, it was pitch black in the basement, and the detectives wondered how he could see what was happening. Richard also added that he had not seen Connie's body due to darkness, so he was not sure his wife was dead. Another suspicious moment was the wounds Richard had received from the wire cutters. All of them were superficial and posed no threat, but what's interesting is that most of it was on the left side of the torso. Given that the man was right-handed and that it was the right hand that was not tied to the chair, he could have inflicted these wounds on himself. There was also no bruising or bruising on his body. According to the man, he struggled with the criminal and fell down the stairs, which was supposed to lead to abrasions, but they were not there. Richard's shorts had blood on them, but Kisu also found inconsistencies with his story. If the man had been stabbed with a sharp object while he was sitting on the chair, at least a few drops of blood would have been applied to the lower part, but there was no trace. The same goes for the place in the basement where the perp hit Richard with the wire cutters. There should have been a lot of blood on the floor where the chair was, but forensics only found a few small drops. But that's not all. According to Richard, after the criminal escaped, he regained consciousness for some time and then crawled up the stairs from the basement to the first floor. However, there was no blood on the steps, although the man was wounded and should have bled out. Another strange detail caught the attention of the detectives. As they examined the crime scene, they noticed that the window in the basement was open. The police admitted that the perp could have entered the house through him, but there was one interesting thing. Locks were pulled out of the window, and this was done from the inside. At another window, they were also pulled out. The investigators decided to do a little experiment. They tried to open it from the outside, but it only happened when one of the policemen struck the frame and knocked it down, breaking the window. Thus, the detectives doubted that the criminal could have opened the window, even without locks, without breaking the glass. This led the investigators to believe that Richard's story might have been fabricated. They went back to the hospital and asked him if he and Connie had any marital problems. The man said he had a mistress, but Connie didn't know. According to his story, he and his wife wanted to have a third child, but Connie couldn't get pregnant, so Richard suggested surrogacy, and he chose his former classmate to play that mother. She recently got divorced and wanted to have a baby. Husband and wife offered her the following plan. She will give birth from Richard, and then the three of them will raise this child. The woman agreed. They had originally planned to undergo a medical insemination procedure, but the service was too expensive. They decided to do it more naturally, and Richard made intimate contact with her, after which she became pregnant. According to him, he was totally cool with it and supported everything that was happening. The detectives very much doubted the veracity of the story, as it sounded completely unnatural. They kept asking Richard more questions, and his story changed again. Just minutes after this story, he stated that Connie and his girlfriend had never met or even talked. He also said he wasn't sure if his wife knew about the pregnancy. Though after further talking to the police, he admitted at all that he had been cheating on his wife with his former classmate for several years and that Connie was unaware of what was happening. Detectives contacted this woman, and she said she had been romantically involved with Richard less than a year earlier. She knew he was married, but thought the man was in the process of divorcing her because he had told her himself. The woman got pregnant in June, 6 months before it happened. Richard insisted that he had already hired a lawyer for the divorce and was going to complete the process by the time the child was born. However, the investigators found out that the man had not actually consulted a lawyer. Besides, everyone Connie knew said she never mentioned divorce. All this was enough for the detectives to start looking at Richard as the prime suspect. However, they could not find any hard evidence against him, so the police began to consider all possible options. This is where they found something interesting. Friends and relatives of the family told them that Connie had complained about a construction worker with whom they had problems. He did some bad work on their house, and the couple tried to get some of the money back, but the contractor turned out to be very aggressive, and Connie admitted that she feared him seriously. It was because of this problem that he and Richard bought 2 pistols and also installed an alarm system. Investigators looked into the man, but he had an uncontested alibi for the time of the murder. They eventually returned to their only suspect, the victim's husband. For months, the police had not told the public that they thought he was a possible murderer. All of Connie's acquaintances and relatives believed that there was an unknown robber behind the crime and felt sorry for Richard. The detectives spent a lot of time talking to Connie's closest friends. They stated that the woman would have clearly told them if she had known about her husband's affair, especially if his mistress had become pregnant. Other family friends noted that after the murder, Richard behaved strangely. He did not look depressed or upset, and a few days after his wife died, he actually texted a few neighbors where you usually order food. Digging deeper, the police discovered that Connie and Richard were in serious financial trouble. Meanwhile, the wife did not understand where their money was going, while Richard was secretly spending them on his mistress. Her smartphone also found a note with a headline, "Why do I want a divorce?" There were women who said that Richard was always lying, mistreating her and her children, taking her money without asking, and so on. Therefore, the investigators concluded that Connie herself had thought of ending the marriage, but that she had no idea of her husband's secret life. Investigating the financial side of the matter in more detail, the police discovered that just 5 days after the murder, Richard had attempted to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's insurance account. But security denied it. A month later, he received a check from his wife's employer for $75,000. All of this suggested that Richard may have had an ulterior motive to kill, but did not prove his guilt. Another curious fact was that Richard cancelled the contract with the preservation firm just 19 days after the murder. If his story about the perpetrator were true, it would be the most illogical move, jeopardizing not only the man himself, but also his 2 sons. Trying to find any evidence, the detectives got a warrant to go through every electronic device in the house. Here they were finally waiting for something serious. Having gathered all this information together, the police were able to reconstruct the exact chronology of events. On the morning of 8:44, the security system recorded the garage door opening and closing. Investigators determined it was Connie who went to practice, as she had already been caught on the cameras near the gym at 8:53. At 8:50, Richard, who was still at home at the time, first disabled the alarm and then turned it back on again. After that, he had to leave the house and go to work. But at 8:59, the man again switches off the alarm using his remote. Given that he was only a few meters from the system itself, Richard had to come home. It was consistent with his story that he was driving back to pick up the laptop. But there was one problem. A man said that he had received an alarm on his way to work. However, no violations were recorded by the security system during this period, which means that no notification was received. At 9:02 p.m., Richard entered his email from a tablet and 2 minutes later wrote to his supervisor that he would be delayed because he had an alarm. There is another discrepancy. Not only that there were no alarm notices, but Richard also lied about the letter to the police. He said he sent it right after he received the notification, a few kilometers from his home. But the tablet data showed that he was at home at the time the letter was sent because he was connected to a home Wi-Fi. The man was in the house for at least 4 minutes before he found the robber, and everything that happened next took less than a minute, which was impossible, even in theory. But the most important piece of evidence was Connie's fitness bracelet. She arrived at the gymnasium at 8:53, but she got out a few minutes later after class was cancelled. At 8 p.m., the bracelet stopped reading the steps, which led investigators to conclude that Connie got into the car and drove home. It took 8 minutes to get there, and this is where Richard said the perp attacked his wife right after she entered the house. But the data from the bracelet denied this. The woman walked 370 meters inside her home between 9:18 and 10:17 a.m. Data from her social media account also showed that she was online for 6 minutes in that time range. So Connie entered the house at 9:18 and was alive for almost an hour, which is completely inconsistent with her husband's story. An important factor here was that the police had not just theoretical inconsistencies on their hands, but full digital evidence. It took the police more than a year to gather this detailed information, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For the vast majority of his acquaintances, this event was a real shock. They all had no idea what evidence the police had been able to gather and continued to consider Richard a victim. The man was accused of murder and initially wanted bail of $5 million, but his lawyer insisted that Richard had a clean criminal record, as well as 2 minor sons in care. As a result, the amount was reduced to $1 million, and he immediately deposited the money. Richard spent 5 years awaiting trial because the trial was constantly delayed. It only began in April 2022, and during this time, the lawyer of the man managed to collect many interesting facts. The defense provided evidence that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown person were found in the house. They also indicated that very little gunpowder had been found on Richard's hands. If he had been the one who fired the shot, it would have been much larger. The prosecution disproved these arguments. It was not until a few hours after the man was taken to hospital that the gunpowder was tested. In that time, Richard could have wiped out most of the footprints. As for the DNA, there was no evidence that it belonged to the mystery man. These samples could have come from anyone visiting Richard and Connie's house at least once. In turn, the prosecution provided a detailed digital map of the spouse's movements that morning, which refuted Richard's claim. The evidence indicated that the woman died an hour after she was allegedly shot by an unidentified plunder. So far, she's been moving around the house and using social media as if nothing happened. Richard's story was also a powerful argument for the prosecution, as the men changed their testimony repeatedly. All the contradictions in his words were used as further proof of the falsity of his story. The trial lasted 22 days, and on 10 May 2022, a jury found him guilty. Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison. However, he maintained his innocence. His trial was a terrible ordeal for Connie's family and friends, as they learned of all the evidence against her husband only during the trial. Until this point, many of them continued to believe the story of the unknown robber, but after all the cards were laid on the table, there was no doubt that Richard was guilty. However, the men's lawyers have announced plans to appeal the sentence until it is reviewed, but so far they have not had the desired result. As for Connie's sons, they stayed with Mom's relative. They were 6 and 9 years old at the time of the murder, but the children lived with their father until sentencing. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and make sure to like under this clip. If you liked it, also recommend subscribing to my channel, where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thanks for watching. The woman was found dead in her home. The police began to investigate and immediately discovered several disturbing leads. The longer they worked it out, the more weird and creepy things came up. A few years later, they finally managed to get to the truth, but no one expected such an outcome. Friends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like, it's very important to me. Karen Gregory was born on March 29, 1948 in Albany, New York. She was the eldest of 4 children and helped her parents take care of their siblings from an early age. The girl was interested in sports and spent a lot of time in nature. Besides, she loved art and wanted to work in this direction. After graduating from high school, Karen enrolled in a college in Rochester. There she earned a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science degree. After this, a woman worked for several years as an art teacher in primary school and then decided to become a graphic designer. In 1983, when she was 35, she moved to Florida, where she met a man named David McKee. He worked as a manager for an organization that provided counseling services to Vietnamese veterans. She and Karen quickly developed a mutual sympathy. The couple dated for a little over a year, and in the spring of '84, David asked her to move to a town called Gulfport. Prior to this, Karen had rented an apartment with her friend and had to drive her car to David's. The woman accepted the offer and began gradually moving her belongings to him. On May 22, Karen took the rest of her things from the apartment and finally moved out of them. She told her neighbor that she was a little nervous. David went to another state for work to speak at a conference, and she had to bring a whole week in his house alone. From the apartment, the woman went to her friend. They had a great time at her house. Karen told her that she is very happy with David and is happy to finally live with him. The friends communicated until about midnight, after which Karen drove to David's house. The next day, the man called home several times, but no one answered the phone. He thought Karen might have stayed in her old apartment and called her roommate, but the woman said she hadn't seen her since yesterday. David then called several of Karen's friends and her sister, but none of them saw the woman. He kept trying to reach her all day, but received no answer. The next day, on 24 May, David called home again early in the morning. He was hoping to catch Karen before she left for work, but still no one picked up the phone. A little later, he called her boss and found out that the woman had not come to work. At this point, David's anxiety reached its limit. He feared something bad might happen to Karen, so he called local hospitals and police station. Upon learning that no one matching Karen's description had been admitted, he decided to call his neighbor Emma. The man asked her if Karen's car was in front of the house. She looked out the window and answered, yes. It only added to the alarm. David asked the neighbor to go to the house and try to knock on the door. He was so worried that he stayed on the line until Emma left to do his bidding. Emma went to the side door first and knocked, but there was only silence. Then she came to the front door and immediately noticed something strange. Most of the door was glass, and in some places it was broken. Shrapnel lying on the path in front of the house. Emmy walked around the house and saw that one of the windows was open. As she approached, she shouted Karen's name several times, but there was no answer. Then the woman stretched her hand out of the window, pushed the curtain back, and a shocking sight opened before her. The window was in the bedroom, and behind it was a corridor. There was a woman's body on the floor, covered in blood. Emma couldn't see her face because it was behind a wall. She knew Karen was there. Recovering from the shock, Emma ran to her home, where David was still waiting on the phone for her. The woman picked up the phone and barely said anything terrible had happened. After that, she dropped the call and dialed 911. The doctors quickly arrived at the scene, but they only had to confirm Karen's death. The detectives began to examine the crime scene, which was horrifying even experienced police officers. Based on the amount of blood all over the house, Karen fought her attacker to the last. Traces of blood ran from the corridor to the front door, where several pieces of glass had been broken. At this point, detectives noticed several stranded hairs matching Karen's. They assumed that the woman almost managed to run into the street, but the attacker caught up with her. In the bathroom, the investigators were waiting for the first clue. They found a bloody footprint on the floor. The police checked Karen's legs and found no trace of blood on them, which means the footprint belonged to her killer, except it was unclear why he walked around the victim's bathroom without his shoes. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that she had received about 20 stab wounds. She was also assaulted, and experts extracted the biological material of the perpetrator. Unfortunately, no DNA test was used in '84, so this evidence couldn't help them identify the killer. In addition, several bloody fingerprints were found on her body. They were too smeared to be used. According to the experts, the woman was killed about 30 hours before being found. It meant she was attacked the night she got home from a friend. There was another point that immediately caught the eye of the police and the doctors as they saw Karen's body. She was wearing a tank top and a lacy corset. Apparently, the perpetrator did it When the police finished searching the crime scene and collected all possible evidence, they allowed Karen's friends to start cleaning. The women didn't want David to see all that horror when he arrived. All the victim's acquaintances knew how much the man loved her and wanted to ease his suffering. David's conference was held across the country, so it took him a long time to get home. Meanwhile, detectives began interviewing the neighbors. This area was considered quite prestigious and safe. The crime rate there was extremely low. Many residents knew each other, and they even had a neighborhood watch. It's a form of arrangement between neighbors where they keep an eye out and report any suspicious activity to the police. In this case, however, the neighborhood watch did not perform its function. Detectives discovered that on May 23, at around 1:15 a.m., 16 residents of the area heard a piercing woman scream, and none of them called the police. They all said the scream snapped quickly, and they didn't get the impression that anyone could be in danger. Even the head of the neighborhood watch, who was living pretty much against the victim, didn't feel the need to call the police. He was fixing his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio when he heard a muffled scream. The man came out of the garage, walked down the street, and did not notice anything suspicious. After that, he returned back. A neighbor who lived opposite David shared an interesting observation. On the morning of May 23, she saw that the front door of his house was open. She also heard the scream that night, but did not connect it to the open door. There was a nuance to her story. When the police arrived, the door was locked. Given that the body had been in the house for about 30 hours, the perpetrator could have come back and tried to cover his tracks, including closing the door. It is noteworthy that there were no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Detectives assumed that the perpetrator could have climbed through the back window, but there were no signs of forced entry. Either Karen left it open all night, or she knew the killer and she let him in. The head of the neighborhood watch shared another interesting observation with the detectives. The night after Karen's murder, an unidentified man drove up to her house. He got out of the car, knocked on the door several times, and kept looking around. The man then returned to the car, but a few minutes later he again left with a piece of paper in his hand. He put it on Karen's windshield before he left. The police immediately checked the car and indeed found a note on the glass. It said, "Karen and David, hi, stopped by your place around 7:15, but saw no sign of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back. But I have what you asked." Detectives immediately paid attention to the formulation "no signs" of signs of life, given that at the time of the arrival of this man, Karen was dead almost a day. Such a choice of words was very disturbing. At the end of the note there was a name, Peter. The researchers tried to find him. It turned out that all the time he was right in front of them. Shortly after the discovery of the body, the man heard about it from Karen's former neighbor and went to their house. The man cooperated actively and answered all questions. He volunteered his fingerprints and feet and told me what he was doing outside the victim's house. According to Peter, a few days earlier, Karen had called him and invited him and David to dinner. But there was one thing: Karen allegedly told him that David would also be with them, although he was already on his way for a week. Peter was also asked what exactly he meant by the phrase in the note, "I have what you asked for." The man said he borrowed the tape and was going to return it. Another strange thing was that Peter allegedly missed the shards on almost the entire path to the front door, not to mention a few broken windows. The man insisted that he had not seen anything like this or did not pay attention to it. While talking to him, one of the detectives noticed a large cut on Peter's hand. Seeing a policeman staring at his hand, the man closed the place and said that he constantly had some scratches after playing with dogs or repairing his car. All of the above seemed extremely suspicious, and the detectives decided to check his alibi. Peter said he slept at his house the night of the murder, and his roommate confirmed it. The police took their time to dismiss him as a suspect, as an alibi of this kind could be easily lied about. However, the investigators quickly found another suspect. David is Karen's boyfriend. According to him, he was in Rhode Island that night, 2,000 km from his home, sleeping in his hotel. But at the scene, the police found a very interesting lead. There was a local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23, the same day Karen was killed. It was very strange, and the detectives began to wonder if David might have flown to Florida, killed his girlfriend, and been back before his next performance at the conference. They calculated the time of flight and travel from the airports, and then came to the conclusion that this is indeed possible. On the plus side, no one could corroborate David's alibi for that night, as he allegedly slept in his hotel room alone. The head of the neighborhood watch also shared his observation. He repeatedly noted that there were arguments between David and Karen when a woman visited his home. David insisted that they had a great relationship and the couple almost never fought. When David was asked about the newspaper, he said he bought it on May 21 at a store near his home. The man was going to take her on a trip so he could have a week's forecast. Investigators came to this store and the seller confirmed that they had the newspaper for sale. He even remembered that David had bought it on the 21st. According to the seller, the publication did issue the issue in a few days, which is common in print newspapers. Thus, the suspicion of David faded. They asked him if anything was missing from his home. The man discovered there was no white lace corset that Karen had bought herself a few months earlier, almost the same as the one who was dressed as Karen's killer. This immediately led the detectives to believe that the perverted criminal took him as a trophy. The police decided to follow up on another lead they found at the victim's house. It was a very high-quality clock drawing signed by the name of Stephen Fisher. Detectives noticed one particular detail. The leaf looked like it was covered in blood. Detectives quickly discovered that Stephen was working with Karen at the same company and interviewed her colleague. There were many interesting things waiting for them. Almost all the employees said that Stephen was a rather strange man. He tried very hard to look after all his female colleagues, shared pictures of perverted things with them, even wrote a perverse poem trying to persuade colleagues to read it. All the women who worked with him confessed that Stephen scared them. Karen also complained several times about his behavior, but the management did not pay much attention to it. The detectives talked to him, and the man denied giving Karen the drawing. He also stated that he barely knew the victim and offered to undergo polygraph in order to prove his innocence. The investigators quickly arranged such an interrogation, and here began the most interesting. It was quiet at first, but after one question, Stephen suddenly said he killed Karen. Just seconds later, he took it back and said it had nothing to do with anything. The strange thing was that in both cases, the polygraph operator did not fix the lie. It threw the detectives off, but they couldn't rely on the polygraph. This instrument is very far from ideal and simply is not able to accurately determine a person's lie or not. In doing so, they realized that Stephen was clearly a very strange man and could say anything. Experts soon examined his drawing and concluded that the red spot on his drawing was left with ketchup, not blood. As a result, they began to doubt that Stephen had anything to do with Karen's murder. Despite this number of suspects, the police were never able to gather enough evidence against anyone. The case had stalled for several months. The detectives were still investigating, but failed to find new leads. It lasted until December, when something interesting happened. One of Gulfport's esteemed residents was retiring, and a special event was organized to commemorate the event. It was attended by a large number of people, including a woman named Mary. She talked to a policeman who was also there. The conversation revolved around the murder of Karen Gregory, and Mary inadvertently mentioned that she also heard her shrill scream that night. The officer immediately noticed a strange point. Mary lived 2 blocks from Karen's house, and initially, the police didn't even question the residents of those remote homes. The fact that the woman heard the scream said it was really loud. Except the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite Karen's house, described him as muffled. But if the scream was heard by the neighbors 2 blocks away from this place, the man obviously couldn't find him quiet. Especially since at that moment the man was in his garage with the door open. All this was doubtful, but the police were slow to suspect the head of the neighborhood watch, George Lewis, 22 years old. He worked as a firefighter and was a good friend of almost all officers of the local police station. He lived with his wife and young child. All the neighbors referred to him as a trustworthy and decent person. However, the detectives could not ignore Mary's story. They called George and asked him to come by the station when he had time. The man agreed but never came. It's worth mentioning that before that, he came to the station regularly just to hang out with his friend. The lead detective on the case was at his wedding, so it was hard for him to picture George as a killer. Only a month later, in January of '85, they were able to talk to him. George insisted that the scream did not seem so loud to him. The detective asked him if he had remembered anything else about that night. He asked him if he had forgotten anything else. But George told him the same thing except for one moment. When his statement was taken for the first time, the man said that he heard a scream, went out of the garage and walked down the street. But this time he said that he had only come to the road, looked around and came back. Given that many months had passed since then, the discrepancy did not seem to be serious. However, the police decided to verify that he was telling the truth and offered to undergo interrogation. George agreed, but to their surprise did not pass it. The next time he spoke to the detectives, the man admitted that he had hidden one fact from them. He said he saw an unknown man outside Karen's house that night. All George could remember was that he was tall and his hair and beard were red. The detectives again doubted that he was telling them the truth. George never quite explained why he didn't mention the man. All he said in the first interview was that he was scared because the man knew where he lived and could have harmed his family. Despite this, the police tried to check this lead and find this man. However, the result was zero. Here was another nuance. Between George and Karen's houses was almost 30 meters, and the street was pitch black. The detectives doubted that a man could see the color of another man's hair, but George kept insisting on his. The police recreated the events of that night and asked George to describe the man who stood 30 meters away. The man couldn't see a single detail, which made the detectives even more suspicious. However, they searched the area and asked the locals if they had noticed a suspicious man with red hair who could walk their streets at night. To their surprise, several women at once admitted that they sometimes noticed a man peeking in their windows at night. None of them saw the man's face, but one woman did manage to spot him, and she said he looked a lot like George Lewis. She wasn't 100% sure because it was dark outside and the man ran away. George admitted that he did occasionally look into the neighbors' windows, but claimed to have done so specifically for their own safety. He said he was just trying to make sure they were okay because he was in charge of his neighborhood security as head of the neighborhood watch. But all this only reinforced the suspicion about him. In March of '85, George agreed to a second polygraph. This time he changed his story again. The man confessed that he had not only seen the man in front of Karen's house, but had come to talk to him. He told George that he would kill him if he told anyone about him. The polygraph operator fixed the lie again. Then the investigator asked George directly whether he had killed Karen Gregory. The man replied in the negative, and again his words were considered false. After that, the detectives decided to talk to his wife. She said that that night she woke up from a piercing scream and was very scared. She tried to find her husband and went to the garage, but he was not there. In addition, the garage lights were off. The woman then returned home and sat in the kitchen waiting for her husband, who returned half an hour later. Detectives also decided to dig into George's biography and talk to his ex-wife. She admitted that the man only seemed a kind, caring, and responsible man. In fact, he was very aggressive and raised his hand to her during frequent quarrels. She added that sometimes he even strangled her. After that, the investigators talked to George's close friends, and they also said something interesting. A few months before the murder, when Karen wasn't still living at the guy's house, but she visited him from time to time, George told friends that he liked her. Moreover, the detectives learned that the man occasionally participated in orgies and mentioned that he wanted to invite Karen to participate. During these conversations with George's friends, they learned that in the summer of '84, the man had a secret affair with a girl who lived in several houses from him. The police talked to her and learned something else. The girl confessed on her 17th birthday. George gave her a white lace corset. He was great for her, but the man still made the girl wear the corset regularly. The police asked them to give it to them and immediately showed it to Karen's boyfriend. He said the exact same size and the exact same size as Karen disappeared from the house. It was the first serious piece of evidence against George, but the detectives kept digging. They took his footprint and sent it to an FBI expert to compare it to the print found on Karen's bathroom floor. After a while, the results came back. Complete match. In March '86, George was called back to the police station, and the detective asked him several times if he had been at Karen's house the night of the murder. The man denied it until the detective told him about the results. Over the next few minutes, George continued to deny everything, but then gave the police a new story. This time he said he saw that red man outside Karen's house. George ran into her house and saw all around her, covered in blood, and a woman lying in the corridor with a cut on her throat. After that, he panicked and ran away from there, deciding never to mention that horror again. Of course, the detectives never believed the story for a second because it sounded completely implausible. But George was right about something, and there was a cut on the victim's throat. Except this information was never released. Even if his story were true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut because of the amount of blood on Karen's body. At least it wasn't visible to experienced medical experts until the blood was washed away. It followed that the only way George could have known that a cut existed was if he was the killer. The above was enough to finally arrest the man. He was taken into custody on March 15, almost 2 years after the murder. In Florida, he could face the death penalty for his actions. George's close friends and colleagues at the fire department did not share the police's belief that he was the killer. They still thought he was a good man and made every effort to help him. These people gave part of their salary to George's wife and child, and even raised $300,000 to bail him out. To do this, several of his colleagues even mortgaged their homes. As a result, George was released in late December. He lived in his house for another 6 months, and the trial did not begin until 4 June '87. George's lawyers insisted that the man did not kill anyone and never changed his version of what happened to the police. However, when the suspect was given the floor, he came up with a completely new story. It was the same. He saw a man near Karen's apartment, ran into the house and saw her body. George was very sick from the sight. He ran to the bathroom, where he vomited. Apparently, this was his way of explaining the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. But here was one obvious nuance. If he had originally run into Karen's house barefoot, the bloody footprints would have been from where her body was found to the bath, but they weren't there. Asked why he had not called the police, George stated that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too scared to tell anyone. It is worth noting here that a man from the age of 18 worked as a firefighter and regularly faced with monstrous situations at work. But when he saw his dead neighbor, he suddenly refused to even call the police. The prosecution insisted that George had been sympathetic to Karen for several months. Waiting for her boyfriend to leave for a week, he decided to take advantage of the situation. George broke into her house and attacked her. The woman managed to scream and even resist him, but eventually the man killed her and abused her. As for his footprint on the bathroom floor, there may be a simple explanation. According to his wife, George didn't come home until half an hour after the scream. Apparently, he tried to wash his clothes off from the blood in Karen's bathroom and took off his sock boots, which were also covered in blood. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury eventually found him guilty. A month later, when his sentence was due, the judge suddenly ordered a retrial. That's what George's lawyer tried to get, and they succeeded. They insisted that the police had compromised some of the evidence and that the prosecution had failed to fully prove their client's guilt. The decision of the judge was a real shock to all those involved in the proceedings, as it rarely happens. However, the prosecutor managed to challenge this decision, and in 1989, it was revoked. As a result, George was sentenced to life imprisonment. The death penalty was abolished because the man had no criminal history before the murder. Since then, The man has tried to challenge the verdict several times, but has been rejected every time. Many of his friends and relatives continued to believe that he was innocent, despite all the evidence against him. George died in prison in 2014. He was 52 years old. He insisted to the last on his innocence, and even gave an interview in which he described how hard it was to be punished for a crime he had not committed. In this whole story, I want to mention one important point. 16 neighbors heard Karen scream, but none of them dared to call the police. Given that the police station was close to their street, the patrol could have been there within minutes. The detectives who worked the case assumed that Karen's life could have been saved, but that didn't happen. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and be sure to like it under this clip if you like it. Also recommend subscribing to my channel where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thanks for watching. The girl stayed in the car in the store parking lot for only a few minutes, but when her mum came back, the girl was gone. The police quickly joined the case, who tried to find her before the snowstorm. This case was followed by the whole district, but what happened next shocked literally the whole country. After all, it is almost impossible to believe in such a turn of events. Friends, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like, it's very important to me. Carissa Boudreau was born on 4 October 1995 in Yarmouth, Canada. The girl's parents separated before she was born, but her father, Paul, was always very involved in her daughter's life. Carissa was active and cheerful, liked to walk with friends and did sports. But her main love was animals. The girl loved spending time with them and even began to think about becoming a veterinarian in the future. Shortly after her daughter's birth, her mother, Penny, had a relationship with another man, and Carissa lived with him for 10 years. After that time, the woman broke up with her partner, and later she got together with another man named Vernon. He and Carissa moved with him to Bridgewater, and the girl was very unhappy with this move. First of all, she loved spending time with her father almost every day, but now she couldn't because of the distance. Secondly, Carissa had to replace a spacious private house with a small 2-bedroom apartment. At the same time, the girl also did not get along well with her mother's new partner, although he tried to build a good relationship with her. All these factors led Carissa to argue with her mother. A few years later, when she was 12, she thought about moving in with her father. It would allow her not only to see her father again every day, but also to take a break from her constant quarrels with her mother. Penny thought about the idea and eventually decided it might actually benefit her daughter. As a result, Carissa moved in with her father and lived with him for about 5 months. However, the girl faced new difficulties. She had to transfer to a new school where she knew no one, and in the city she had no friends at all. The move was much harder for her than she thought. Eventually, Carissa decided to return to her mother. At least there she had many friends and old school. The girl was happier to return to her normal life, despite the fact that he and his mother continued to quarrel over domestic trivia. Carissa considered it right to return. On January 27, 2008, a girl and her mother went shopping in a supermarket. On the way there, they had another argument, because of which Carissa did not want to go to the store with her and decided to stay in the car. Penny, who planned to take a few things and come back, agreed to leave her there. She didn't care that something would happen to her daughter, much less in such a short period of time. Bridgewater was a very safe city with few serious crimes. However, when the woman left the store, the girl was not in the car. Penny walked around the parking lot, calling her name, but Carissa was nowhere to be found. It was a cold January, and by nightfall, a heavy snowstorm would have started. The woman doubted that the girl had decided to go out in this weather, and almost immediately decided to go to the police. The officers quickly began their search. They needed to find the girl before the storm, as heavy snowfall would reduce their chances almost to zero. After a while, they decided to organize a press conference at which Penny addressed the public, hoping that people would help her search. She also turned to her daughter in case she left of her own free will, and asked her to return home. In the meantime, the police went around all of Carissa's friends and acquaintances, but no one saw the girl that day. The mall parking lot wasn't under surveillance, and the footage inside the store only showed Penny, so it didn't get the cops any closer to finding Carrie. At that time, the main version of the investigators was as follows. After a fight between the girl and her mother in the car, Carissa became offended and decided to either walk or just run away. But the fact that she could not be found in a small town for several hours made the police think that something terrible might have happened to her after she got out of the car. Despite the officers' efforts, the girl was never found. In the evening, a heavy storm broke out, and the police were unable to resume their search until the next day. But here too they failed, until the third day they received their first tip. On 29 January, a man was driving along a road outside the city and noticed a pink shoe on the side of the road. Like all residents of Bridgewater, he heard about the girl's disappearance, so he decided to contact the police. The officers took the shoe, and Carissa's mother confirmed it belonged to her daughter. The policeman focused his search on the area, but all attempts to find her were stalled. The search continued for another 2 weeks until the police received a call on 9 February. The woman and her son were driving along a road about 20 km from Bridgewater. They stopped briefly on the side of the road, and the son got out of the car. After a few seconds, his mother heard a scream. Downstairs, the boy saw human feet sticking out from under the snow. Given that they were a good distance from the road, the woman couldn't be sure what it was. She pulled over a car that was driving past them, pointed the driver to that spot, and he confirmed that it really did look like human legs. Then they called the police. The officers came to the scene and removed a human body from the snow. It turned out to be Carissa. The medical experts had to wait a few days as she was frozen. The first thing they saw was that the girl's genes were at half-mast. On the basis of this, the experts committed violent acts but found no evidence that Carissa had been subjected to violence. As to the cause of death, the victim died by strangulation, and experts doubted that she had been killed at the place where the body was found. It looked like she'd been placed thereafter. No evidence was found, and the police still had no idea who killed her. For the residents of a small city, what happened was a real shock, since there has not been a single murder in the last 20 years. Moreover, the unknown perpetrator was still at large, and parents had stopped sending their children anywhere else. In the absence of any suspects, investigators began looking into Carissa's family. Her mother's roommate, Vernon First. The man admitted that he and the girl did not get along well, but this was not the main reason to think about his involvement. The chief investigator of the case was in constant contact with Carissa's mother, and her behavior seemed a little strange to him. Even before her daughter's body was found, she asked virtually no questions about the progress of the search and was largely silent. When the body was found, the woman did not even ask the cause of death, which was also highly suspicious. The investigators were wondering if the woman knew what happened to her daughter in the first place and was hiding it. The police decided to search Carissa's room, hoping to get any leads. There they found 2 notes that were some kind of victim's personal diary. On the first note of December 2, 2007, the girl made a list of things that she did not like. There were items like "Mom engaged to Vernon." "She made me move here. I don't like Vernon living with us." In the second note, the girl also complained that she did not like living in the apartment and felt under constant pressure. However, the fact that the girl lived in an apartment turned out to be useful for detectives. They started interviewing all the neighbors who shared interesting observations. After Carissa disappeared, neighbors often heard Penny and Vernon arguing. Because of the poor noise insulation, they could read every word, and here the police were waiting for very unexpected details. According to the neighbors, after Carissa disappeared, Vernon was screaming, "I know you did it and why you dragged me into it." The day Vernon found the body, he was screaming, "Penny, how could you do this? I don't understand why you had to drag me into this." This turn of events was extremely unforeseen for the detectives. 3 days after the body, they brought Penny and Vernon to separate interrogations. The investigators asked the mother if she had anything to do with her daughter's death or if she was hiding something from the police, but the woman was just repeating that her lawyer advised her not to answer any questions. Vernon was also reluctant to share any new information, and then the detectives came up with a plan. Given that they had absolutely no evidence at all, it took a trick to solve this high-profile case. They arrested Penny and Vernon, put them in separate police station cells. Each of them was assigned undercover officers who played the role of other detainees and had to try to get them to talk. Unfortunately, None of them gave any new information. The next day, the police had to release Penny and Vernon, but this whole operation has paid off. The man who was with Vernon offered him a part-time job. Given that he had a problem with that, Vernon contacted him almost immediately after leaving the cell, and the men continued to communicate. They called periodically, and Vernon gradually began to trust this man. 2 months later, in April, he and Penny decided to move out of the apartment, and he contacted an undercover cop about a job. During their meeting, the man first talked about the Carissa case and said that it had nothing to do with her murder. According to him, he was sleeping at home and did not know what was happening. Sometime after the girl disappeared, he began to suspect that Penny was behind it. When the body of the victim was found, he accused the woman of killing her. She did not confirm that she had done it. However, from her reaction, the man understood everything. He thought about going to the police, but was afraid Penny would pin the crime on him. For the same reason, he continued to live with her for fear of provoking her. An undercover officer passed this information on to his colleagues, who agreed that Vernon's fear was not groundless. If his mother had accused him of murder, things might have gone against him. However, they still had no evidence to arrest the victim's mother. For several months, they thought about how to bring her to justice, and at one point they had the opportunity. On June 11, Penny contacted an undercover agent who was sitting in her cell. Back then, she mentioned that she had certain skills and connections that could help avoid criminal responsibility, and Penny didn't decide to use her services. They agreed to meet in a hotel room. The police took the next room, installed bugging equipment and hidden cameras. The woman told Penny she could help, but she had to tell her all the details of what happened. It was supposedly necessary to understand the scale of the problem and to come up with the most appropriate solution. And it worked. Penny said that her relationship with Vernon started to crack at the seams, and the man gave her an ultimatum. She had to choose between him and her daughter. On January 27, the woman actually went to the store with Carissa. And there was another argument between them. Penny decided to get rid of her. She made up a story, left Carissa in the car in the parking lot, and went shopping. Before she got back into the car, Penny called Vernon and left him a voicemail saying her daughter was missing. But it was a lie. Carissa was still sitting in the passenger seat. The woman got into the car and drove to the road on the outskirts of town, where they would later find the girl's shoe. She told her daughter to get out of the car, pushed her to the ground, and strangled her with a splint. Penny added that her last words were, "Mummy doesn't have to," but the woman didn't stop. The mother put her daughter's body in the car and went to the place where she would later be found. On the way, she put the splits in a coffee cup and threw it into the snow. As she reached the spot, Penny threw Carissa off the slope leading to the river. But before that, she pulled down her pants, hoping it would confuse the police and make them look for violent motive. The woman knew there was a snowstorm heading for the city, so she knew her daughter's body would notice. She then came home and personally told Vernon that the girl had disappeared. They called her friends and acquaintances together, and Penny called the police. After this story, the woman took the undercover officer to the exact spot where she left her daughter's bodies. She also admitted that she had been planning to kill her for weeks and was just waiting for the right moment. Immediately afterwards, the police contacted Vernon. The man stated that he had never given Penny such an ultimatum. He couldn't even imagine that a woman would kill her daughter or even give her up for him. In fact, Vernon was dissatisfied that Penny and Carissa were always making scandal. The man asked her to try to keep her quarrels to a minimum and to mend fences with her daughter. Otherwise, he would have to break up with her. So the detectives realized that the decision to kill was 100% personal choice and the mother's desire. The confession was enough to convict Penny, and on June 14, she was arrested. The woman was told that her confession was recorded and that she had finally confessed again. She was initially charged with first-degree murder, but the women expressed their intention to retract their confessions in court and challenge the sentence. In the end, the investigation made a deal. She was asked to plead guilty to a judge and be charged with second-degree murder, which implied a lighter sentence. As a result, the woman was sentenced to life with a right to early release after 20 years. However, the court has since relaxed her conditions of detention on several occasions. First, she was given the right to apply for parole after 15 years in prison, but there are no guarantees of her approval. Secondly, in 2018, she was allowed to go out under supervision to attend church and see friends. In subsequent years, including 2023, the court continuously increased the number of such withdrawals, and now a woman can go free every month. As for Vernon, no charges were brought against him, as the man did not have anything to do with Clarice's death. Obviously, the only culprit was her mother. However, he continues to share some of this guilt. In the man's opinion, he had to understand what Penny was capable of and prevent what happened. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and be sure to like it under this clip if you like it I also recommend subscribing to my channel, where I often publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thank you for watching. The girl left her friend's house on her bicycle and disappeared without a trace. A few hours later, dozens of people came out looking for her, and the police got involved. Despite the fact that the detectives had a perfectly clear version of what happened from the very first days, this case stretched out for years until an unforeseen ending shocked everyone. Friends, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's very important for me. Parrick was born on September 2, 1996 in the small American village of Constantine, Michigan. She was cheerful and active and enjoyed sports and outdoor activities with her friends. She also often went fishing with her older brother. On November 8, 2007, when Jody was 11, she left school and came home. Soon after, the girl decided to visit her friend, who lived only a few minutes from her home. Jody took her bike and waited for her brother to see her off, which is what their mother always insisted on. The woman was afraid to leave her daughter alone, despite the fact that their village was a relatively quiet place. The brother walked with her and later had to escort the girl back home. But when he came to her friend's house again, her parents said that Jody had already left. The boy did not pay much attention to this because she had to drive only a few hundred meters. But the girl was not at home. Her mother was worried. It was already evening, and Jody should have been back a long time ago. She'd never been anywhere without permission, so the woman was very hesitant that Jody would just hang out. The mother went to her friend's house and told her that Jody never came back. The girl's parents immediately called her uncle, a reserve police officer named Ray McCann. He came to them and offered his help in the search. Jody's mother, along with other family members and acquaintances, drove their cars and began searching the village. The area of this settlement was less than 5 square kilometers. They drove along the school, playgrounds, parks, and other places that the girl might have gone. Her mother also drove home. Her mother also drove home to all of her friends, but none of them saw Jody after school. When it was dark outside, the women decided to go to the police, and the officers immediately joined the search. The mother occasionally came across other people who were driving around the village looking for her daughter, and at some point she crossed paths with Ray, the police reserve. They talked about places they'd already looked, and then Ray asked if anyone had looked in the local cemetery. The woman considered this question very strange. Why did the man think about such a particular place? Besides, Jody obviously wouldn't have gone there of her own free will and could only have been there if something had happened to her. The detectives started investigating, and the first thing they did was talk to Jody's mum. During these interviews, it appeared to the investigators that the woman was withholding information from them. They didn't say exactly what made them think that, but soon the mother did. The police admit she had something to do with her daughter's death. After finding no corroboration, investigators turned their attention to Jody's older brother, a boy who was 13 years old and almost directly charged with murder. The police suggested that he and his friends could have done something to the girl. However, this version was not confirmed. When the information about the interrogation of the mother and brother of the victim came to the media, the police stated that they were merely based on statistics. Most often behind the killing are relatives and close people, so they had to work this line. At the same time, Ray, for some reason, was in no hurry to check his own guess, looking elsewhere. As a result, the woman and other people decided to go to the cemetery, and already at the entrance to him, she noticed something alarming. Jody's bicycle lay at the entrance, and a few tens of meters away, the mother discovered her daughter's body. It wasn't until the girl's body was handed over to the medical examiners that the cause of death was strangulation, that there were no visible wounds. From the marks on her wrists, the experts concluded that the girl had been wearing handcuffs or plastic ties for some time. She was also assaulted, but the experts did not find any traces of semen from which a DNA sample could be extracted. However, they noticed a small speck of blood on Jodi's clothes, and a more detailed examination also found traces of saliva. After analyzing both of these samples, the experts pulled a DNA sample from an unknown male who was not in the FBI database. Eventually, they stopped considering their involvement and turned to another suspect. During the investigation, they learned that Ray McCann had asked 4 times in the evening if anyone was looking for a girl in the local cemetery, but he never went there. Given that her body was found in this particular location, this behavior seemed suspicious. Investigators questioned him, but the man denied any involvement in the murder. According to Ray, he spent the morning of November 8 at home playing video games. When his 2 sons returned from school, he went with them to the local store where he bought them the toy pistols the children had asked him to. After that, they went home. At about 5:00 p.m., Ray's wife came home from work. The family had dinner, and at about 8:00 p.m., the man was told that Jodi was missing. He went searching in his car alone. After touring half the village, he met other people who were also looking for the girl and asked if anyone had inspected the local cemetery. At the interrogation, Ray was asked why he had pointed to the place. The man stated that he was guided by his police experience in banal logic. Dozens of people searched for the girl for hours in a small village, and no one thought to search the cemetery. When asked why he did not go there himself, Ray replied that he was looking at other places, and eventually he did get there. By that time, a lot of people were there, and the girl's mother found her body. The police had no evidence to link Ray to the murder, so they continued to investigate for months. Investigators conducted several hundred interrogations and took DNA samples from 300 villagers, including Ray. But all this brought no results. Since then, the case has dragged on for years, as detectives have been unable to find new evidence. But the cops never stopped thinking that Ray was behind the murder, and eventually they focused on proving his guilt. In the years following Jodi's death, he was interrogated more than 20 times. The man had never used a lawyer and had taken a polygraph test twice. Despite this, the sheriff's office became increasingly convinced that the killer was sitting right in front of them. In the summer of 2011, detectives decided to change tactics and increased pressure on Ray. Hoping to get a confession, he was called back for questioning and told that they had irrefutable evidence that suggested that he had left the girl's body in that cemetery. The investigators also stated that the prosecutor's office had already considered the case and were prepared to bring it to trial. In conversations with him, the police assumed that he might have accidentally stumbled upon the girl's body or inadvertently killed her. They tried to get him to confess anything, but Ray kept insisting he was innocent. In subsequent interviews, the detective stated that the victim's DNA was found on his clothes and inside his car. Ray kept insisting that he hadn't touched Jodi and suggested that the DNA might have gotten there after he pulled her mom away from her body that night. However, the investigators stated that the woman had refuted the allegations. In addition, the police said that they had surveillance footage from the village, which contradicts his alibi. Ray said that he was sitting at home playing video game that day. However, the police said that they spotted him in the street on one of the recordings. Ray kept insisting that he was telling the truth. Back then, the detectives used another bargaining chip. After examining his computer, they discovered that on the day of the murder, a man was visiting erotic websites. In their opinion, this further indicated his involvement in the murder. They also insisted that Ray had 2 sets of handcuffs. Some of the men ratted them out early in the investigation, but forensics didn't find any trace of Jodi's DNA. Ray insisted that he never had a second set, but the cops didn't believe him. However, their interrogations were inconclusive and they had to release the man. By then, everyone in the village already knew he was a suspect, and believed that Ray was getting away with murder. The detectives also repeatedly spoke to his relatives, including his 2 sons and his daughter, 4 years after the murder. They asked them if the boys had gone to the store with their father to buy toy pistols, and they could not remember. In addition, the police have repeatedly told Ray's wife that there is enough evidence against him to put him away for murder anyway. For example, they said that sand was found on the victim's shoes from the back of their house. As a result, a woman divorced him, taking the children. Ray continued to live in freedom, but everyone was 100% certain that he was the one who killed Jody. But there was one important nuance in the whole story. The evidence that the police had been talking about for years was not really there. They deliberately lied about Jody's DNA being found on his clothes and other things in an attempt to get a confession. They had no DNA, no camera footage, sand on the victim's boots from his backyard and everything. The only thing they had was a man offering to check out a cemetery, and most importantly, investigators had every right to lie about having evidence to try and get a suspect to talk. But none of this helped them get a confession, and in 2014, they decided to arrest Ray. However, they could not charge him with murder, so the man was charged with 5 counts of perjury. These episodes were based on the fact that Ray sometimes gave contradictory information during various interrogations over the years. For example, some of the participants in the case could not recall the negotiations with Ray that day, which the man himself described during the interrogation. He was also accused of lying because he denied the presence of the second handcuffs, although no evidence to the contrary was available to the police. The man hired a lawyer who called the charges against Ray completely baseless and ridiculous. He pointed out that the police officers were clinging to inaccuracies in his testimony several years after the incident, but the judge sided with the investigators, and Ray was convicted of perjury, receiving 20 months to 20 years in prison. All the villagers, including Jody's relatives, were happy to see a dangerous criminal behind bars. Although Ray was still not charged with the murder, he was able to be isolated from society and give the police more time to finally find the missing evidence. This continued until 2015, when something unexpected happened on July 28 in a nearby town called White Pigeon, just 5 minutes from the village. A 10-year-old girl was riding her bike down the street. At some point, a man came out of his garage and asked the girl to help him move the boxes. She knew the man, so she got off her bike and went to his garage. As soon as the girl was there, the man pulled out a knife, grabbed her, and tried to tie her with plastic ties, but she managed to escape and escaped. The girl was frightened and ran home, where she told her mother about what had happened. Moreover, she recognized this man. Daniel Parlang was one of them. The woman immediately reported it to the police. Like all other residents, she remembered Jody's murder perfectly, and at the time, people were not yet convinced that Ray was the culprit. But the police said that Daniel was a well-respected man, so she shouldn't worry. The investigators spoke to him, and the man stated that he had not been following anyone. That was the end of the story. However, the woman continued to consider Daniel suspicious and even dangerous. Since then, she hasn't even let her daughter go alone into their own backyard. Let's go back to 2015. After Daniel was arrested, they took a DNA sample from him and loaded it into the database. To the surprise of the detectives, they immediately got a match to an old case, the murder of Jody Parrak. His saliva and blood were found on her clothes. It was further revealed that at the time of Jody's murder, he lived only a few streets away from where she had disappeared. The police only spoke to him once and did not even ask for a DNA sample, as Daniel did not seem suspicious. Then she immediately told about the incident. The police quickly joined the case, and the attacker was arrested. It was 65-year-old Daniel Parlang, who had previously worked as a sports coach for children. After searching his house, the detectives found a list with the names of several local girls. Given that he had just attempted to abduct the girl, the police immediately assumed that the list contained the names of other potential victims. After examining his background, investigators discovered something else. He used to live in the same village as Jody, but he's never had a criminal record. However, a very strange episode occurred on November 18, 2009, 2 years after Jodi's murder. A 12-year-old girl was walking home from school, passing a house. She noticed a man peering around the corner and staring at her. A few years after the murder, he moved from the village to a nearby town. There the man lived with his wife, children and grandchildren, having an excellent reputation among neighbors. After his arrest, the detectives found another possible victim for Daniel. In 1997, a 6-year-old girl went cycling near her home and disappeared without a trace. By a very terrible coincidence, at that time, a man lived nearby. Several witnesses caught a glimpse of a suspicious man driving around the area, and based on their testimony made a portrait of the suspect. The man in the picture looked a lot like Daniel. In that case, the police failed to find any evidence to link him to the case, and the man was not even considered a suspect. On September 10, 2015, he was charged with Jodi's murder. At first, he denied involvement, but then investigators offered him a deal. They promised to drop the charges for the recent attempted abduction of the girl, as well as grant immunity for all other crimes he may have committed in the district. In this case, the man could have received a slightly shorter prison sentence rather than a life sentence. In return, Daniel would confess to Jodi's murder and reveal all the details of his actions. The man asked for time to talk to his family, and an hour later, he accepted the offer. Daniel said he was cleaning his garage that day. After noticing a girl passing by on her bicycle, he approached and asked for help moving boxes. When the girl entered the garage, he attacked her, tied her up with plastic ties, and abused her. He then killed her and took the body with the bike to the cemetery. As a result of this deal, Daniel received 30 to 60 years in prison. Given his age, he had little chance of getting out of prison after sentencing. He made a final statement saying that he was ashamed of what he had done and sincerely repented. A few weeks after that, an ex-sheriff came to visit Ray in prison. The man thought the policeman was going to apologize to him for the false accusations. However, the sheriff managed to surprise him. He stated that he still considered Ray an accomplice in the case and accused him of helping Daniel to commit the crime. At the same time, Daniel himself said in interrogations that he never knew Ray. The sheriff later gave an interview to a local TV station and said he had absolutely no regrets about Ray. He explained that he had arrested him, not for murder, but for perjury, so his conscience was clear. Ray remained in prison until December 2015, when it was time to apply for parole. When he was released, the man moved to another town and only occasionally came to visit his father's grave. A year later, Ray became interested in a documentary studio. They put out a request for all the evidence in this case and found out something interesting. During Ray's trial, the sheriff claimed that he had video footage from a security camera that proves that Ray lied about his location in the wind, looking for Jodi. The sheriff was referring to security footage from a local factory. During interrogations, Ray said that he had come to the cemetery along a particular path, but the sheriff said that the camera footage denied these words. In fact, it turned out that this camera did not capture the trail at all and was directed in a different direction. This fact caused a wave of indignation in the media. It is not clear how the court mistook the words of the sheriff for the truth and did not check the real record, but the fact remained. This episode was one of 5 that put Ray in prison, and the sheriff, who happened to be the one who lied under oath, didn't get any punishment and retired honorably. Due to widespread public outcry, the court reviewed the charges against Ray, and in December 2017, they were completely dropped. 2 years later, the man received a $40,000 payment. Given that Ray had lost his entire family, spent almost 2 years in prison, and suffered several attempts on his life there, this was not an outcome he was comfortable with. He wanted the sheriff and the other parties responsible for his broken life to be held accountable. Therefore, in late 2019, he filed a lawsuit against them, resulting in an additional payment of $88,000. However, the authorities appealed and the decision was reversed. Ray is still trying to get justice, but due to the bureaucracy involved, the process is still stalled. Remarkably, even Jodi's mum still thinks he's somehow involved in her daughter's murder, despite the confession of the real culprit. the result is likely to be years of lies by investigators focused on one suspect. Their behavior led the real killer to spend years on the outside and almost kill another girl. If she hadn't managed somehow to escape this garage, she would have shared Jodi's fate. That's what Daniel said after he signed the deal when he was asked what he was going to do with that girl. But the police were not responsible for this, nor for the destruction of Ray's fate. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and be sure to like it under this clip if you like it. I also recommend subscribing to my channel where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thank you for watching. The girl from a small American town was left alone at home and disappeared without a trace. The police immediately began to look for her. Looking at the girl's computer, they discovered the first clue that led them to a shocking truth. Further events shocked the public, as no one had ever experienced such horror before. Friends, I recommend that you follow my channel and like it. It's very important to me. Woody was born on October 17, 1989, in Holland, Arkansas. She had 2 older brothers and loving parents. But when the girl was 7, their family was in trouble. In 1997, she and her parents went to pick up her brother from a baseball game. On the way back, they had an accident. As a result, her mother died. For their whole family, this tragedy was a great challenge. Casey's father continued to raise 3 children alone. He also worked as a policeman and had to spend a lot of time in the service. As a result, she became very independent from an early age. She cooked her own food, washed and cleaned her own food. Casey tried to help her father and brothers, even though she was the youngest. She was also very active. She sang in the school choir, played saxophone, attended a local church and spent much time with her friends. On December 3, 2002, when Casey was 13, she stayed home alone all night. Her father was working, her brother stayed in the college library, and the other brother had already moved to another town. A friend of Tim's, who was attending a training course, also lived with them, but he wasn't home that night either. Casey's maternal aunt, who lived next door, was also absent. In the end, the girl had to spend the evening alone, which was her usual routine. Before leaving school, she asked her 2 friends if they could stay with her. However, their parents did not allow it. Casey's house was on the outskirts of town and was almost completely surrounded by trees. Because of this, it was hidden from prying eyes and neighbors. Her brother's friend returned around 10:15 p.m. Casey was nowhere to be found, and the house was quiet. He thought that the girl was sleeping in her room and was going about her business. Tim came home at 11:40. He decided to check on his sister and look in her bedroom, but the girl was not there. Given that it was almost midnight, the boy immediately contacted his father. Although Casey was very independent, she was only 13 and could not leave at this late hour. Their father immediately came home, where he noticed some disturbing thing. Casey's glasses were broken, her computer was on, and their dog, the Yorkshire Terrier, was limping, like he was getting some kind of injury. His father contacted his colleagues and reported his daughter missing. Right after that, he started calling all her friends and their parents, hoping the girl had just gone off to one of them. However, no one saw Casey after school. The man also noticed that all of his daughter's coats, warm clothes, and even shoes were still at home. Considering it was December night, she obviously couldn't have gone anywhere. The police immediately began searching, and very soon they received the first clue. On the girl's computer, an online chat was opened with her friend Scott. Casey's brother looked into the correspondence and saw that his sister had sent him a final message at 9:41. After which she did not contact him. Scott continued to write to her without any response and began to worry and wrote to Casey's girlfriend, after which he tried to call the girl's home phone, but there was no answer either. Tim wrote to him, hoping the boy could shed some light on Casey's disappearance, but he had no idea where she had gone. The only thing he knew during his correspondence, the girl also spoke on the phone with another friend named Dave. At the same time, she stopped answering messages a little before 9:41. She disappeared for a few minutes, and when Scott started texting me if everything was okay, she just answered and disappeared again. Casey's disappearance was quickly joined by the FBI. The agents spoke to her family and friends, who shared the same concerns. According to them, The girl spent a lot of time in online chat rooms, chatting there with various people she had never seen live. She mostly corresponded with two guys, 14-year-old Scott from Georgia and 17-year-old Dave from California. She met them months before her disappearance in a teenage Christian chat room. She first started talking to Dave, and they quickly hit it off. The guy told me that he has an aunt in Arkansas who's in a coma from a car accident, and the doctors don't see any chance of recovery. Casey reminded me of her mum's death, and she hardly spoke to anyone about it. But Dave understood her and could listen. They became more frequent, and the girl introduced him to other close friends, Samantha and Jessica. Casey also told her family about Dave. A few months after meeting her, they began to call regularly, and eventually Casey would talk to him literally every day. The father of the girl was generally not against the fact that his daughter was dealing with someone online, but her friends were very wary of this. It was 2002, and talking to people online wasn't the usual thing. In addition, in this online chat room, there was no way to make sure that you are communicating with the person you say you are. Dave only sent Casey a picture of himself once, but her friend kept taking it seriously. A few months later, Casey met 14-year-old Scott in the same chat room, and the two began talking. The two soon began a relationship. Casey also had some feelings for Dave, but still chose Scott. The problem was, Dave was 18 at the time, and the girl was only 13. When her father found out about the young man's age, he told his daughter that Dave was too old for her and forbade contact with him. However, Casey did not listen to him, as she believed her father was fanning the problem out of nowhere. To her, Dave was just a friend that she could talk to about her day. On the day of the girl's disappearance, her friend saw a picture of Scott in Casey's school locker, and she was very worried. Casey said the guy emailed her the picture, and Samantha started arguing with her. She said it was extremely reckless to give her home address to people she had never met in person, and that it could be dangerous. But Casey didn't care at all about it, and thought her friend was wrong to react like that. However, Samantha's concerns were not raised out of thin air. A few months earlier, Casey's other friend, Jessica, had stayed at her house for the night. The girls were alone. They called Dave, and the three of them were talking on the speakerphone when the girls heard someone walking around the house. It was pitch black outside, so Casey and Jessica couldn't see through the window. But they both clearly heard leaves and twigs cracking under someone's feet. The girls hid in Casey's room, and soon they heard the squeaking sound coming from the kitchen, and there was one board that was attached every time a man stepped on it. So Casey was convinced there was someone in her kitchen. Friends tried to quietly barricade the door, and Casey whispered to Dave that there was someone in her house. The guy thought it all seemed to them, and they were just winding it up, and soon the noise really stopped. Since then, Casey's friends have been extremely suspicious of her online conversations, especially since she gave Scott her home address. Samantha didn't rule out that Scott might not actually be the 14-year-old guy he claims to be, but an adult criminal who could hurt her. After Casey's disappearance, her friends told the investigators about their suspicions about Scott and that he knew the girl's home address. FBI agents ran the email, addressed the guy used to log into the chat room, and then tracked down his home address in Georgia. The local cops immediately went there to see who Scott really was. Turns out the guy wasn't lying. He was really 14 years old, and he couldn't have had anything to do with Casey's disappearance because they were almost 1,000 miles apart. The teenager's parents confirmed that he was at home with them that night, and Scott was struck off the list of suspects. After that, the detectives switched to Dave, who again contacted Casey's friends, who remembered something else. Shortly before this happened, Dave said his aunt's condition had deteriorated, and he was going to Arkansas to say goodbye to her. Friends also added that Dave seemed strange to them. They repeatedly spoke to him on the phone, and it seemed that his voice sounded older than the stated age. However, the girls were only 13 years old, and an 18-year-old boy seemed like a grown man, so they didn't really think much of it. In addition, Dave sometimes uttered words and phrases that modern teenagers no longer used and are more likely to hear from their parents. The experts tried to trace it to an email address, but this time they failed. Then they decided to act in the old way. Holland was a small town and had already been searched by hundreds of people. They tried to find the girl, But now the investigators added a new task to the police. Officers had to go to all the hotels in the area to find Dave, or whoever was hiding under that name. The detectives had very little information about this man. Casey introduced himself as Dave Fagan and said he lived in San Diego. For this reason, the investigators decided to search for any matches, even the smallest. They even told uniforms to look at people with the same initials. Early in the morning, police began to tour all the hotels, both in Holland and in the nearest settlements. Half an hour later, one of them spotted a car with Californian plates parked outside a motel in nearby Convoy. He talked to a hotel employee who said the car belonged to 47-year-old David Fuller, who checked in the day before Casey disappeared. The motel clerk shared a few more observations. Immediately after arriving, Fuller stated that he did not need room service and asked not to be seen for a week. He was also hysterical when he discovered that he could not connect his laptop to the internet and complained that he would have to go to the local library. The police decided to search his room, where a strange sight awaited them. The men's suitcases stood on the floor and the bed was made. The motel clerk said that Fuller had apparently never slept in the room, since the bed was clearly made by their maid. On the suitcases was a camouflage suit, and he was wearing a pair of rubber gloves. In the room were also found his laptop. Detectives asked a logical question. If Fuller didn't sleep in his bed and apparently didn't show up after the check-in, where did he sleep for 2 days? Given that his car was parked in a motel parking lot, they decided to check out car rental services. A few minutes later, they arrived at a nearby company whose employees confirmed that David Fuller had rented a minivan from them. At the same time, the man behaved strangely. He was visibly nervous and constantly went out to smoke in the process of completing the contract. The detectives received 2 important tips from the company's employees: Fuller's phone numbers and credit cards. Here they came to a disappointing conclusion. Fuller's phone number matched the one that regularly called Casey's house. By comparing their time, the police were able to confirm that Dave, 18, was hiding behind a 47-year-old. After checking his credit card history, they found out that the man had also rented a warehouse across town. A local officer and 2 FBI agents immediately headed there. They were almost certain that Fuller and Casey were there, but they had no idea the girl was still alive. They arrived at the warehouse around 6:00 a.m. When they found the right cell, the officer saw that it was unlocked and raised the door. Inside was the same van. Its engine was running. FBI agents cautiously headed for him, but the next second a gunshot sounded. Officers ran out of the room and called for help. They were afraid to return fire because Casey could have been inside the car. If the girl was alive, any improper action on their part could have led to her death. 2.5 hours later, special forces arrived at the scene and headed for the warehouse. Fuller's body was seen behind the van. There was a gun in his hand, and there was blood coming out of his head. The officers knew immediately that he had killed himself as soon as the FBI agents opened the vault door. In the van itself, they found Casey's body. She was lying face down on the floor with her arms chained to her legs. Medical examiners later determined that she had died from a gunshot wound a few hours before Fuller, and that she had also been assaulted. They found a bottle of chloroform and a rag next to it. Based on this, investigators have constructed a likely picture of what happened. Apparently, Fuller broke into Casey's house and used the chemical to put her to sleep. He then took the girl to his van and drove to the warehouse, where he raped her and killed her. The news of the murder of the case shocked the whole city, which has not faced such brutality in a long time. However, it was not all, and soon the public found out even more disturbing facts. Investigators continued to work on the case and found that Fuller had repeatedly come to the attention of the police. He had a wife and 2 children, but in recent years, his behavior has changed dramatically. He has distanced himself from his relatives and started to behave aggressively. His wife was seriously worried that he might harm her or the children, so she filed for divorce in 2002. The woman later said that Fuller could sit at his computer for hours, talking to someone on the internet and ignoring what was happening around him. He also began to take regular evening walks, during which he spoke to someone on the phone. On one occasion, a man was arrested for exposing himself to 2 girls. However, he received no serious punishment. Fuller's wife also once accused him of taking a shower with their daughter, who was 7. Child Services did an investigation, but couldn't find any evidence. After his wife left him, Fuller moved into a rented apartment in Lames, California. The officers searched the house, finding a collage of Casey's photographs attached to her address and the addresses of her friends. After examining his computer, the experts found that he had interacted with 3 other girls on the internet, but they were not affected by his actions. But the most disturbing thing lay ahead. After scrutinizing Fuller's actions, the police learned that he had visited Holland twice before Casey's murder. He first came there in October. The detectives admitted that the man was following the girl, studying her daily routine for his further plans for the abduction. The second time he arrived in November, Fuller rented the same motel and a van from the same company. Apparently, that's when he planned to commit the crime, but something went wrong. And then the detectives remembered a story from a friend of Casey's when the girls saw someone breaking into their house. The officers concluded it was Fuller. He may have planned to kidnap Casey, but that was the night she called her friend and the man came home. Interestingly, Fuller was on the phone with Casey when he entered her house. He did the same thing a month later in December. According to Scott, the girl was talking to Dave until she stopped answering her texts. When Fuller returned home in November, he bought steel chains, duct tape and clamps. He also found a special company that sold him a large bottle of chloroform. With all this information, the detectives began to think that Casey might not be Fuller's first victim. The policeman noted that he had approached the abduction with such precision and detail that they had little doubt he had done so before. His DNA was entered into the FBI database, but the man was not linked to any unsolved murders. Of course, this database only contains DNA samples from the criminals who left them behind. Therefore, the results of the investigation did not guarantee that the man was not involved in the other murders. It is possible that Fuller simply did not leave his samples because he knew that this could be the way to find him. However, over the years, the investigator failed to link him to other crimes. After Casey's death, her family established a non-profit organization to educate children and their parents about the dangers of hiding online. This case was also one of the first of its kind that the perpetrator used the internet to kidnap and kill a person. A year after Casey's death, her case was taken to the NIPT and FBI as a prime example of why children should be protected online. Share your opinion in the comments and do not forget to like under this video. If you liked it, I also recommend subscribing to my channel where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thank you for watching. A 15-year-old girl disappeared from her bedroom under mysterious circumstances. She was sought by the FBI police and hundreds of volunteers. As they delved into the case, the detectives discovered many horrific facts and eventually solved this alarming case. In this video, we're going to tell you what happened to Riley Crossman and why the public resented finding out the hard truth. Crossman was born on December 22, 2003, in the small American town of Martinsburg, West Virginia. Her parents divorced when she was young, and the girl moved with her mother and younger sister to Berkeley Springs, a town 40 km from Martinsburg. After a while, her mother started seeing another man, and they had 2 more children. Riley maintained a close relationship with her father and visited him regularly. She attended Berkeley Springs High School and studied dance and singing. She also had a boyfriend named Hayden Lacey. According to her parents, they had a great relationship. Riley was happy. She and her boyfriend even shared an Instagram account where they shared photos. Her mom, Chantel Oakley, worked 2 jobs. On May 7, 2019, she took an early morning shift off due to poor health. Upon arriving home, she texted Riley that she was going to sleep before the evening shift and asked her to wake her up when the girl returned from school. Riley came home at about 3:30 in the afternoon, woke up Mom and went to her room. She was also with Chantel's sister-in-law's mother, who was actually her grandmother, and looked after the younger children. Chantel got home from work around 10:00. Walking past her daughter's room, she saw that her door was closed, but the light was on behind her. Her mother thought that Riley was getting ready for bed and had gone to bed almost immediately. She was still not feeling well and wanted to get some sleep before the morning shift. At about 7:15 the next morning, Chantel looked into her daughter's room before she left for work, but Riley was not there. However, she did not see anything suspicious in this. Classes at the school began at 7:45 and the girl could already go there. Riley's school was only a few minutes walk away, so she made her own way. Around midday, the mother called from school and said that Riley had missed a few classes. This alarmed Chantel slightly, but she still saw no cause for serious concern. Her daughter could just skip a few classes and go out with friends. Around 3:30, Riley's grandmother began to worry. The girl should have come home by now, but she was still not there. Then she contacted Chantel, and at that moment, the mother suspected something was wrong. Riley always called or texted her to ask her out with friends after school. But on that day, she did not receive a single message from her daughter. The mother sent her several messages, and all of them did not reach the addressee. Then she tried to call her, but it went straight to voicemail every time. That said, Riley's phone was either dead or turned off for some reason. Chantel also called Riley's own father, hoping that the girl could have gone to him. However, he did not contact his daughter that day either. The mother asked her grandmother to go to school and look for Riley there. Grandma went there, but she could not find the girl. None of the teachers knew where she was either. At around 5:00 p.m., Chantel decided to take a leave of absence from work, came to school, but she also failed to find her daughter. In the parking lot, she spotted her boyfriend and asked if he'd seen Riley. Hayden stated that he had spent the entire day on a country trip and had not even contacted her. Together, they went around the school, looking in the building and in the surrounding area. But the girls were nowhere. After a while, her mother decided to go home in the hope that Riley might return there. Unfortunately, she wasn't there either. After waiting a while longer, she decided to go to the police. By that time, the girl's father had come to Berkeley Springs to look for her daughter. He's been all over the small town asking people he met if they've seen Riley. With a population of just over 600, most of the residents knew each other. A local teenager said he saw her walking down the street. Unfortunately, this information did not help in finding Riley. Researchers thought that the boy just mistook. The police quickly began to search along the way and interview all known girls. None of her friends saw Riley that day. She never showed up at school. Several teachers noted that she had attended their lessons. At first, this led the detectives astray, but soon it became clear. These teachers simply did not notice the absence of the girl and noted her. From conversations with Riley's acquaintances, the police began to reconstruct the chronology of events. They found out that on the evening of May 7, the girl was talking to her boyfriend on the phone until about 10:30 and also answered her friend's social media messages until midnight. The next thing you know, at 5:40 in the morning, Riley called her boyfriend on video, but he was asleep and didn't answer. The detectives immediately suspected something was wrong. Why did Riley try to contact him at this early hour? The girl's mother insisted that Riley would never run away from home. She simply had no reason to. Given that she was the eldest child in the family, her mother treated her very kindly, practically never forbid her to go out with friends or boyfriend, allowed her to visit her father in another city at any time, and generally did not control her every move. The only thing Riley ever told her about her plans was asking for permission. Given that the girl was only 15 years old at the time of her disappearance, she did not have a driver's license, so she could not leave town by car either. This further indicated that the theory of the escape seemed unlikely. Instead, the detectives saw kidnapping as the most likely theory. The same night, Riley's mother went to law enforcement. They started looking for the girl. The police searched the school and the surrounding area and the town. They were quickly joined by local volunteers who cared about Riley. As it usually happens, residents of such small towns believe that nothing like this can happen to them. Soon, the police decided to search Riley's bedroom, and there was the first terrible evidence. On the pillow and sheets, they found small stains of blood. These items were sent straight to the lab, where forensics analyzed the DNA and determined that the blood belonged to Riley. In that moment, everyone realized that something really terrible had happened to the girl. If her family had hoped to the last that Riley had left on her own initiative, those hopes were dashed after the discovery of the blood. It is worth clarifying here why the mother did not notice traces of blood when she examined her daughter's bedroom. A few hours earlier, the bed had been made and she had not thought of lifting the blanket. This finding not only indicated that the girl was most likely to have been attacked, all this happened right in her house, and the police had to find out who could have done it. After finding the traces of blood, the scale of the search increased. More volunteers joined the police in the following days. Dozens of people also provided a variety of equipment that might be useful in the survey. At some point, detectives even had to ask the public to stop carrying equipment to the station, as it was already in abundance. In addition, the police repeatedly gave press conferences to convey the story to the public. There's always a chance that someone might have noticed something strange, heard suspicious conversations, or stumbled upon potential evidence, so it was important for the police that everyone in the district knew about Riley. The FBI, Homeland Security, and the state police joined the local police. Together they continued to search for the missing girl, but nothing came of it. On 15 May, law enforcement agencies decided to attract additional forces and organized a large-scale search covering a wide area of many kilometers around the city. And the next morning, they announced they'd found Riley Croisman's body. It was about 40 minutes' drive from Berkeley Springs, near the country road, near the top of a small mountain. Detectives immediately realized they were dealing with a murder, not an accident. It looked like the unsub was trying to hide the body as far away from prying eyes as possible. Medical examiners examined the body and confirmed it was Riley, except they couldn't establish cause of death due to severe decomp. It was very strange because it was a little more than a week since the girl disappeared. Apparently, the killer did something to the body. The investigators noticed a few more strange moments. Firstly, the girl was wearing only one shoe. The second they could not find anywhere near. Secondly, they concluded that the unknown perpetrator had changed her clothes because they had information that the girl should have been wearing leggings and a hoodie, while she was found wearing shorts. In addition, her clothes were stained with whitewash or plaster. The police reclassified the case as a homicide, and now they had to find the culprit. They re-interviewed all of Riley's relatives and acquaintances and noticed something strange. The testimony of Andy McCauley, Chantel's partner, does not match the story of another man. Andy worked on a construction site in nearby Hedgesville. He initially informed the police that on May 8, Riley's birthday, he did not leave his workplace from morning until late at night. However, around 10:00 the same day, a neighbor spotted a green Dodge pickup truck in front of the house. The neighbor knew that this car didn't belong to Andy or Chantel, and Andy had his driver's license suspended. Given all this, the neighbor asked Chantel what this car was doing in front of the house, but the woman didn't know. After Riley's disappearance became known throughout the city, a neighbor decided to share this observation with the police. The detectives interviewed Andy again. They determined that the car in question belonged to one of his colleagues, and the man had never driven it before. The owner of the pickup used to pick up Andy in the morning to take him to work. After learning that the police knew of his movements that day, Andy changed his testimony. He stated that he had actually taken a pickup truck and drove it to buy banned substances so he could later take them with a colleague at a construction site. After a while, he changed his story again and said that he had gone to his home to get the drugs and returned to work. It was already weird, but the detectives were waiting for more terrible discoveries. First, they talked to Riley's mother and asked her to remember if she had noticed anything strange about her partner. Then she told me that on May 8, the day of Andy's daughter's disappearance, she was really acting suspicious. When he came home that night, Chantel told him about Riley's disappearance. The man immediately said that he would go to look for her, got on his bike and left. However, when the woman returned home from a search, she discovered that Andy was sleeping on the couch as if nothing had happened. This behavior was very strange. All of Riley's relatives searched the streets until late at night with the help of concerned citizens of the city, while Andy simply went to bed. as if nothing had happened. In addition, one day after the girl disappeared, Chantel called Andy and recorded this conversation. Unfortunately, its full content was not revealed. All we know is that Chantel was already suspecting Andy at the time and linked all this to his addiction to illegal substances. The police then spoke to Andy's colleague and discovered that the man was actually absent from work from around 9:00 am to 2:00 pm. In addition, a colleague stated that in his opinion, Andy had banned substances with him initially, so he had no reason to go anywhere to get them. After that, the detectives found this very green Dodge and found a large patch of dried plaster in the trunk. Forensics showed it was the same substance found on Riley's clothes. Investigators also led to a pickup of service dogs, who found a body odor in the trunk. They also found several rather specific bolts, which are rarely used on construction sites. 2 similar bolts were found near Riley's body. The police soon found another discrepancy in Andy's testimony. They examined the security footage from nearby locations and discovered that on May 8, the man was only a few miles from where Riley's body would later be found. He was caught on the cameras of a gas station and on several traffic cameras. It was all very strange. Andy didn't have a driver's license. He was usually picked up by other people, or he was cycling. But on that day, for some reason, he took someone else's car and drove it for half a day on unusual routes. Another colleague told police that on May 8, Andy asked him for 3 construction bags. The detectives were also approached by Andy's former colleague, who told an even scarier story. He said that he never got along with him, but between 2:00 am and 4:00 am and 4:00 am on May 8, I called him several dozen times and sent him a whole bunch of texts. He was in a panic and said he needed to hide from someone. Andy explained that he had banned substances on him and was afraid of being caught. This former colleague did not let him in that night, but later reported the story to the police. In his defense, the man claimed to have taken the banned substances that night, after which he noticed a parked police car near his house and panicked. It was only at the police headquarters that they checked this information and found out that none of their vehicles were in the area. It meant Andy's story was a simple lie. All this was enough for the police to arrest Areri the day after the body was found and charge him with murder. The man denied guilt, so the case was brought to court. After that, the case stalled for more than 2 years, as the trial did not start until 27 September 2021. This was due to the coronavirus and related restrictions, as well as the features of the United States judicial system, where such deferrals are the norm. However, the trial revealed even more horrifying details of the case. To begin with, Chantel told a disturbing detail about the evening of May 7. That day she returned from work at 10:00. Andy was sleeping on the couch. When she entered the room, the man woke up. Upon seeing his eyes, Chantel immediately thought that he had taken illegal substances, that he had previously taken powerful drugs, and even had a criminal record for possession, of which the woman was well aware. The prosecution further disclosed alarming messages sent from Riley's phone shortly before her disappearance. On May 7, at 11:00 p.m., the girl wrote to her boyfriend that Elle wrote to her boyfriend that Andy had just entered her room. After 12 minutes, she sent another text saying she was scared. She never contacted him again. Unfortunately, Hayden had already gone to bed and had not seen these messages. By morning, they had already been deleted. At the trial, he also revealed that Andy had visited Riley's room several times that evening. The girl was talking to her boyfriend via video link, and Hayden heard him enter the room. Andy asked her to wash the dishes and talked about some other household items, but Riley was definitely afraid of him. She asked the guy not to shut down while Andy was in her room. It was also revealed in court that Andy had called Riley several times around 3:00 a.m., but she did not pick up the phone, and the third time she blocked his number altogether. It was all very scary and confusing. The prosecution argued that Andy made these calls to see if Riley was communicating with his boyfriend at the time. The data about these calls were later removed from both phones, but the cellular provider had them. Despite all this, the prosecution had no evidence of what happened that night. They assumed that Andy killed Riley late at night, waited until morning, and went to work. After that, he borrowed a colleague's car, drove to the house, took the body, and drove him to a secluded location. He then cleared the history of messages and calls from her phone and disposed of it. At the trial, it was also revealed that Chantel and Andy's birth mother not only knew about his addiction to illegal substances, they also knew that under their influence, the man became aggressive and dangerous. The final hearing was held on 5 October 2021. Although all the evidence was circumstantial and did not directly link Andy to the murder, the jury reached a guilty verdict. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Further, the possibility of early release was considered. Andy's lawyer was asked to give his client the opportunity after 15 years, but eventually the judge decided on life without the possibility of parole. While the judge pronounced Andy's sentence, he showed no emotion. At previous meetings, he also seemed distant and uninterested. Apparently, he accepted the inevitable. But what about motive? Because of the rate of decomposition, the experts were unable to determine whether Riley was abused. However, this version is the most obvious, although the court failed to prove it. The story was heavily covered by the American media and people were divided. Some blamed the mother of the girl who brought a convicted drug addict to her home and built a family with him. At the trial, she claimed that she had never thought that Andy would harm her children. Others defended the mother, believing that she could not have such an outcome. She spent most of her time working 2 jobs to feed her family, and she may not have had time to think about how her decision might affect her children. What's not clear now is the video call from Riley Hayden's phone at 5:30 this morning, whether the girl was still alive at the time or whether the call was made by Andy to confuse the investigation later. And do you think that Chantel should be blamed for this situation? Tell me what you think and don't forget to put your rating on this clip. Take care and thank you for watching. The woman mysteriously disappeared from her home and her friends decided to go to the police. At first, it looked like she was on her own, but with every new lead, it just got more and more creepy. Eventually, the investigators managed to solve the mystery, and the truth turned out to be quite frightening. Mindy Schloss was born in 1955 in New York. When she was 25, in New York, when she was 25, she moved to Alaska, where she graduated from a local medical university. The woman obtained a degree in psychiatry and became a nurse at Fairbanks Hospital, although she was more likely to work in the field. In the hard-to-reach areas of Alaska, many people were unable to access the hospital on their own, so Mindy and her colleagues used a variety of transport, including boats and planes. She loved her work and approached it with the utmost responsibility. At the same time, the woman lived almost 600 kilometers from the hospital in Anchorage. She commuted to work on the plane and stayed at the hotel for all weekdays, returning home only for the weekend. It was August 2007. Mindy, who was 52 years old at the time, returned to Anchorage for the weekend and was soon to fly back to work. During her absence, she always asked her best friend Jerry to go to her house to feed the cat and give him the necessary medicine. On Saturday 4 August, a friend called her to discuss the matter, but Mindy never came to the phone. She couldn't get through to her all day, and it was weird. Then Gary contacted a mutual friend of theirs, but he didn't call Mindy that day either. At first, Jerry thought Mindy had gone out on business, but she didn't answer the phone the next day. Then her friend decided to drive to her house. Nobody answered the door either, and Jerry used the spare key. At first glance, everything looked normal. The house was in order. There were no signs of a struggle and other evidence that something bad had happened to Mindy. Only at the exit, Gary noticed something strange. The handle of the front door was loose, and the woman decided to twist the screws with a screwdriver, after which she went to work without knowing where her friend had gone. On Monday, August 6, Jerry called the hospital where Mindy worked. To her surprise, a woman never showed up for work, which was completely out of character for her, nor has she contacted any of her colleagues to warn them of her absence. All of this indicated that something could have happened to the woman, and Jerry decided to go to the police. The police department received a missing persons report, and Jerry and the detective went back to Mindy's house. No signs of forced entry were found. Nothing of value was missing from the house either. It ruled out the possibility of a burglar, breaking into a woman's house. Moreover, Mindy had some drugs at home which were distributed solely by prescription. Any robber would probably take them because they were in demand with drug addicts. As they went into the hills, they found Mindy's car missing, which was also very strange. The woman always took a taxi to the airport and used her car only for city trips. The police concluded that something really bad had happened to the woman. The house was searched by a forensic team, trying to find any lead. However, all of this did not bring any results. At that time, the theory of the kidnapping was not very likely. The police thought Mindy might have had an accident. She often went out into the countryside, and the terrain there was quite dangerous. People may have fallen prey to wild animals, or simply accidentally fell off a cliff. However, this version did not bring the police any closer to solving the case, and they decided to start looking for suspects who, in theory, might have been involved in her disappearance. The first thing they did was look into Bob, a mutual friend of Mindy and Jerry. The man willingly cooperated with the investigation, and the detectives quickly established that on the day of the woman's disappearance, he was at work many kilometers from her home. As for the exact time of Mindy's disappearance, the police had no clear answer. The woman had not been in contact since Saturday. After examining her computer, forensics determined that the last time she used it was 1:30 in the morning. With no serious leads, the police decided to seek help from the public. They posted leaflets about the missing women in the city and also distributed the data on local TV channels. On the same day, they started getting calls from witnesses, but most of the leads went nowhere. People reported seeing Mindy in various places and even in other states, but none of these tips ever worked. Meanwhile, Bob and his co-workers decided to search the area where Mindy might have gone. She often went out for berries or just went for a walk there. Unfortunately, these searches also did not bring results. Detectives decided to go another way and contacted the bank, which used the woman. They asked them to check if there had been any activity on her cards in recent days. Here they were finally waiting for a serious lead. Early Sunday morning, the day after Mindy's disappearance, someone withdrew $500 from her debit card, the maximum amount available for withdrawal within 24 hours. The police immediately received the ATM camera footage from the bank, and it was an alarming sight. Turns out the money was taken by an unidentified man, and his face was covered in a bandana, so there was no identification. He only lowered the bandana after his face was out of camera view. Therefore, the police had no choice but to wait until the person tried to use another person's card again. Meanwhile, the detectives received another tip. From Mindy's colleagues, they learned that the woman had planned to renovate her house and hired workers. At some point, she had a conflict with her supervisor over the cost of the work. Mindy later admitted to her colleagues that she was afraid of him as he behaved strangely during visits to her house. The police checked this man out, but he had an alibi for the day the woman disappeared. They also questioned another worker who came to her home on Friday around 7:00 p.m. The man was also not involved, and he could not remember anything suspicious that night. Soon, the detectives were waiting for a new clue. Bank security reported that early this morning, Mindy's credit card was again charged $500, this time from another app. After examining the security footage, the police immediately realized that it was the same man as the first time. However, there was something strange on the recording. The man withdrew the money and left, but after a few seconds he returned to the victim. For a while, he walked beside him, pushed the buttons, and eventually left again. After calling the bank, the detectives found out the reason for this strange behavior. The unsub forgot to pull the card, and the admin then takes it to prevent the theft. The real owner can get it back by contacting the bank with his identity card. Of course, this was not an option for the criminal, so he lost access to Mindy's account forever. This time, the police were able to find a witness. He pulled up to the same admin, and the unknown man got out of there. According to the witness, he got on his bike and drove away. This was a significant lead, as most people were traveling by car or on foot. But all this information was still insufficient to get closer to the solution, and the detectives decided to question all residents of the Mindy area. They asked people to remember any weirdness or point them at neighbors that aroused suspicion. To their surprise, many residents named one particular house located right near Mindy's house. According to them, there were always parties, residents were always noisy and disturbed the public order. The detectives went there and found that there were a large number of people living in the house, but they were unwilling to talk to the police. Then the detectives went to a woman who lived right across from this house. She said she didn't see anything suspicious, but she seemed very nervous. The next day, the woman called the police station and asked the detectives to meet, but not at her house. They met somewhere else, and the woman shared a terrible story. Shortly before the detectives' first visit, she was visited by a man who lived in the house opposite her. He said that the police are walking around the area and asked the woman not to tell them that he lives here. On the question why, as he said he was on parole and he didn't want the police to know where he was. At night, the woman heard someone walking on the porch of her house. She looked out the window and saw that it was the same man. The woman was very scared and decided to tell the police. Detectives found out his name was Josh Wayne, who was 27 years old at the time. When they ran it through the system, they found out the guy was tried for murder 7 years ago. He was then accused of beating a woman to death, but the jury acquitted him. As a result, Josh was charged with falsifying evidence and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. After 3 years in prison, he was released early. Detectives immediately identified him as the prime suspect. After talking to his roommates, they found out that Josh didn't have a car and that he was mostly riding his bike. But there was one problem. When the police started looking for him, the man disappeared without a trace. On Thursday, August 9, the police suddenly had another lead. A local trucker called them and said he spotted Mindy's car in a parking lot near the airport. He saw his picture in the newspapers and immediately recognized the car. Detectives who arrived at the scene confirmed that the car was indeed Mindy's. They also noticed that a security camera was pointing from the nearest building to the parking lot and requested a recording. It showed a man driving his car into the parking lot on August 4 at noon on the first day, coming out and rubbing the door handle. Apparently he erased his prints. Unfortunately, the quality of the recording did not allow to see his face. Sue examined the vehicle for prints or DNA and was able to extract some samples. However, they took time to study and there was no guarantee that they would be useful in this case. Mindy's purse was in the passenger seat, which could indicate that the woman was in the car with the perp dead or alive, without obtaining the desired result from the use of modern analytical tools. Detectives decided to use search dog. Few believed the idea was successful, as a week had elapsed since Mindy's disappearance, but for lack of other options, they turned to canine specialists. The dog was taken to the Atmans from which the man withdrew money and to Mindy's car. The dog picked up the trail and headed down the street towards the woman's house, 3 blocks away. She sniffed the front door and went straight to the house where Josh White used to live. The detectives, who never believed the idea of a search dog, were shocked. The service dog specifically pointed out to them that Josh was in Mindy's car near her house and those Atmans. The next day, the police repeated this experiment with another search dog. The result was the same. The dog came all this way and stopped at Josh's house. Although it was not conclusive evidence that worked quickly in court, the detectives decided not to waste time and obtained a warrant for the suspect's arrest. They went to his house, but the man hasn't been there for days. When they searched the building, they found the same jacket in which the unidentified man was caught on the cameras next to the Atmans and a receipt in his pocket for a cash withdrawal from Mindy's card. They then discovered a woman's gold watch and immediately showed it to Jerry. The woman confirmed that it was Mindy's. Forensics were able to reference the DNA samples found on the steering wheel of Mindy's car with those from his house, and they're a match. That said, Josh was in the car with the missing woman. This evidence was already more serious, and the police were focused on catching the suspect. All over the city, leaflets with his signs were posted and even rented several billboards. According to the detectives, this was one of the largest search operations in Alaska history. Almost all law enforcement officials worked on the issue, and local residents reported any suspicious evidence. At one point, the police published the photos from the atom cameras, and they were approached almost immediately by a woman named Lisa. She said she used to date Josh, and she's sure he's in the picture. What is important here is that the police did not name the main suspect, but what followed was a turning point in this case. Josh's other friend came to the police with a confession. Last week, she helped him move around the city in her car. One day, he left his backpack in the back seat, and the girl and her mother looked inside. There, they found some more atom receipts and a phone. In the gallery, they found a photo of Josh, supposedly holding a gun. For the police, this information only added alarm. The detectives were already so worried that the suspect might attack someone else while they were looking for him. And thanks to his phone, it turned out that he was also armed. The police tried to convince his girlfriend to help them catch Josh. They wanted the girl to take the recorder with her and go with her to meet him and try to talk about what he had done to Mindy. But the girl was too scared and refused. However, she soon became involved against her will. On September 2, Josh came to her home and in an aggressive manner began demanding his backpack. Given that the girl had given it to the police, she had to make excuses on the way. Realizing that she did not have a backpack, Josh asked to take him somewhere far away from the police, but the girl refused. Instead, she offered to stay at her house, but Josh suspected something was wrong and left. The girl knew she wouldn't be safe until the police caught this man. She decided to follow him discreetly in her car while calling the detective. At some point, Josh reached the home of a friend and went inside. By that time, the police, special forces and the FBI had begun to gather together. All feared that the suspect would not surrender without a fight, and these fears were confirmed. Using a gun, Josh took 2 people hostage who were in the house with him. A lawyer was invited to talk to him, and after a few hours he was persuaded to surrender. During the interrogation, he barely spoke to the police, but investigators took the time to accuse him of Mindy's murder. They already thought the woman was probably dead, but without her body, it would have been extremely difficult to prove, so Josh was only charged with stealing Mindy's bank card and watch. The FBI agent decided to go rogue. He told Josh the charges, and he said it was all a lie. Then the investigator said that they had evidence that he was the one taking the money off the other's card, and Mindy herself reported the stolen card to the police. Hearing this, the suspect grinned and asked what games were being played with him. With this reaction, the FBI agent was finally convinced that Josh had killed Mindy, but the police still had to find her body to accuse Josh of murder. They had to work on the weather. It snowed early in the area, and they'd have no chance of finding Mindy if her remains were noticed. On September 13, the police received a call from an electrician who was working near the city of Waysell, almost 100 kilometers from Anchorage. He noticed the body of a woman in a wooded area and immediately thought it was Mindy. The lab expert confirmed it. The deceased was indeed Mindy Schloss. The medical examination revealed that the woman had been shot in the back of the head and her remains had been disposed of by fire. After extracting the bullets, they were able to establish that it was fired from the very weapon that Josh was caught with. The police now had no choice but to understand how the events that led to Mindy's death unfolded. Meanwhile, experts continued to investigate every millimeter in her home, trying to find any trace of Josh's presence. It was very difficult to do this. They had to pick up almost every hair from the floor of Mindy's house. Then they had to examine them in the lab. It took months, but eventually they found a hair that belonged to Josh. The DNA analysis confirmed that, and now the detectives have evidence of the suspect's presence in the victim's house. On 18 May 2008, 10 months after the murder, he was finally charged and brought to trial. There was an interesting situation during Josh's deposition. His ex-girlfriend Lisa, who hid him from a photo outside the ATM, refused to testify in court. She regularly visited her ex-boyfriend in prison, and at some point, the couple announced their intention to marry. The investigators were shocked by this pattern of events, but they quickly realized what was behind the move. The United States Constitution allows relatives not to testify against each other, and Josh apparently convinced Lisa to marry him for these reasons. However, there was one problem. Soon after his marriage, he was declared null and void because marriage to prisoners was prohibited by state law. But the detectives wondered why Josh was so keen to keep Lisa from questioning and testifying. Is it really all about some photo near the atom where you can't even see his face? Most likely, the girl knew much more. The investigators tried to get her to talk, but at first they couldn't do anything. At some point, however, Lisa contacted them herself and claimed that Josh had confessed to her murder during one of her visits to the prison. According to his story, there was a party at his house on Friday night. Josh, who had no means of support, decided to break into the house next door and steal something. This house was Mindy's place. Josh opened her door and started searching the house for valuables. And at some point, Mindy came into the room, and he knew right away that if he let her live now, he couldn't escape prison. He didn't want to go back there, so he grabbed the woman, took her to the bathroom, and tied her hands. The perpetrator then went to his home to get a gun, taking some of his belongings for the abduction. Before he went back to Mindy's house, he put bags on his feet and ducked, taped them to leave no trace. He then took the woman to the garage, put her in his own car, and drove out of town. After an hour's drive, he stopped in a wooded area, took Mindy off the road, where he killed her. After that, Josh went back to her house, cleaned, vacuumed the carpet, and left. The trial began only in the spring of 2009. The prosecution offered Josh a deal. He confessed to killing Mindy and another woman 7 years earlier in exchange for refusing the death penalty. So the authorities were hoping to close 2 high-profile cases at once, and Josh agreed. As a result, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison without parole. During the reading of the verdict, Josh cried, but at one point the situation escalated when the judge called him a coward who killed 2 women. The criminal jumped up and screamed, "What about the men I killed?" At that point, his lawyers grabbed him and silenced him before he said anything else. This shout haunted the detectives for 5 long years until Josh offered the authorities a new deal in 2014. He agreed to confess to killing 3 men if he was transferred from a local prison to a federal one. Apparently, the conditions of detention there were much higher. Given that the offender's request was insignificant, the authorities agreed. Josh told me that he killed a man in Anchorage in 1994 when he was only 14. The next murder he committed was in 1999, and he killed 3 men a year later. The same day he killed a woman. The first 2 men were identified, but the identity of the third remains a mystery. The investigators have no doubt that Josh is indeed involved in these murders. They are more concerned about another matter. Are there any other crimes on his shoulders he's been silent about? In any case, the police managed to isolate him from society forever and prevent other murders that would have followed. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and be sure to like it if you liked it. A student rode her bike and disappeared. The police began searching, but none of them could have imagined what alarming revelations lay ahead. In just a few days, there were so many shocking details in this case that even experienced FBI agents were horrified, and none of them expected such an outcome. Friends, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is very important for me. Sierra Joanne was born on February 11, 1996 in the small American city of Delta, Ohio. She grew up in a very large and friendly family with 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Sierra loved sports and was on the school volleyball team. She also loved to travel. The girl dreamed of visiting Italy and made a lot of efforts to realize this desire until she finally managed to go there. During her studies, she began dating a boy named Josh. After graduating from school, they enrolled in different universities. Sierra planned to take a job with her uncle, who owned a metal processing plant, and the girl decided to get a degree in human resources management. She enrolled at the University of Toledo, located 50 kilometers from her home. Despite the distance, he and Josh planned to meet again and make plans for the future. The couple even began to take their time choosing wedding rings for their future wedding. After 2 years of university, she went to her hometown for the summer holiday. At the time, she still had some learning to do, but she decided to do it from home to spend more time with her family and her boyfriend. Sierra also had an internship with her uncle. At that time, she was already 20 years old, and the girl was well prepared to work there after graduation. On July 19, 2016, Sierra decided to drive to her boyfriend's house. A few days before, she bought a new bike and she couldn't wait to try it out. The girl left the house at about 5:00 p.m. He headed for Josh's house. Later that evening, her mother came home and found her daughter not there. She thought it was a bit strange. She thought Sierra should have come back by now. However, it was summer and the street was only beginning to get dark. Besides, the girl was already 20 years old and her mother did not worry about it. She allowed her daughter to stay at the boy's house. However, things changed when she got a call from Josh at 10:30 p.m. He asked if Sierra was home because the guy couldn't reach her. According to the young man, they separated around 7:00 p.m. and she has not been in contact since. Given that more than 3 hours had passed since then, the girl's mother began to worry seriously. Together with Josh, they started calling the girl's friends and relatives, hoping she'd stop by one of them. But no one had seen her that night, so Mom called all the nearby hospitals, but no one like her had been admitted. The woman decided to go to the police, and at midnight she filed a missing persons report. Despite the fact that Sierra was 20 years old, the police immediately began to look for her. Given that Josh had seen her last, they went to him. The guy said that the girl came to his house after 5 o'clock in the evening. About an hour and a half later, they decided to ride together. Sierra rode her bike and Josh rode his motorcycle. The couple rode the country roads along the numerous cornfields. Next to the bike was a woman's sock, which also had blood on it. He reported the finding to his colleagues, and other police officers arrived shortly thereafter. During a more thorough examination, they found several other items near the bike. They were men's sunglasses, a screwdriver, and a few car fuses. No less interesting was the fact that there were traces of motorcycle tires on the bike through the cornfield. All this was enough for the investigators to reach a disappointing conclusion. Most likely, Sierra was abducted. When things got serious, they started looking into Josh as a possible suspect. First, statistically speaking, it is people close to them who are often criminals. Secondly, that night Josh was riding a motorcycle and the Sierra bike had similar tire track. Besides, the detectives were wondering why the guy wouldn't walk the girl home. She was less than a mile away, and he was on a motorcycle, and he could have come home fast anyway. Josh let the cops search his house, his car, and his motorcycle. And this is where the police came across his overalls, which showed traces of blood. The boy said he wore these clothes on a hunting trip, and the blood belongs to the animals. Investigators handed over the overalls to the experts, who quickly confirmed that he was telling the truth. Otherwise, nothing indicated Josh's involvement. The experts also examined the items found in the field and extracted one DNA sample belonging to an unknown person. Josh immediately volunteered his sample, and it didn't match. As a result, he was no longer regarded as a suspect, and the police began searching for other leads. The next day, a farmer called them. The man told them that on the evening of the disappearance of the Sierra, he was driving along the same road with his son. At some point, they noticed a motorcycle helmet on the side of the road, and the father told the son to bring it to the car. The farmer later examined it more closely and saw traces of blood on it, after which he contacted the police. The detectives admitted that the helmet could have belonged to the kidnapper, but his identity remained a mystery. At that point, the FBI was already involved, and the agents decided to take a close look at that Sierra photo that Josh had taken just before she disappeared. Thanks to the picture, they knew what kind of clothes she was wearing, but the detectives noticed something else. On the girl's wrist was a fitness bracelet. They immediately requested data on the location of this device. However, here investigators were waiting for failure. The device was turned off shortly after the disappearance of the Sierra. Then the police received another tip. Josh told them that when he and his girlfriend were driving down the road, a suspicious white van followed them. The guy had the feeling that the driver was chasing them. The car was driving at slow speed and slowed down when the pair slowed. At some point, Josh even tried to get to him, but the driver drove away. The guy thought it was weird, and he even remembered part of his license plate. The police quickly found the vehicle and its owner. And his motorcycle stalled near the same spot where the police later found the girl's bike. According to James, he saw her bike and decided to get closer, so he headed into the field, pushing his motorcycle beside him. The man added that while he was walking there, he had fallen off car fuses, sunglasses, a screwdriver, and a helmet. Suddenly, his motorcycle started up again, and James drove on, forgetting to pick up all these items. As you may have guessed, the detectives were very suspicious of this story. In addition, a witness had approached them only a few hours earlier and said that on the night of the disappearance of the Sierra, he had seen a strange van on that road. The witness drew attention to him because the car was driving at very high speeds, breaking every rule possible. He got his number and passed it on to the police. When the detectives ran the plates, they found out the van belonged to James, and during the search, they spotted him near the house. The man also allowed them to inspect the van, and the police found something interesting. Inside were a ski mask, duct tape, plastic ties, handcuffs, and maces. By themselves, these objects did not indicate his guilt. However, given James's conviction for the kidnapping, this set aroused suspicion among investigators, but the most horrific finds were waiting for them in one of the sheds. Detectives found a separate room there, behind a hidden door with an air mattress inside, and chains were placed next to it that looked like they were meant to hold a person in that room. Near the mattress stood a refrigerator, inside which the police found traces of blood. there was also a strong smell of bleach, from what they concluded that this blood was carefully cleaned. But the main evidence was the contents of a small box. There were brass and several pieces of women's underwear, one of which had blood on it. All this was enough to at least temporarily arrest James while forensics analyzed the evidence. The man was taken for questioning and asked to explain what the secret room was with the blood and chains. In response to this question, James gave them another questionable story, saying that he had built this room because he wanted to set up his own adult shooting studio. So it was just his improvised set. Of course, the detectives didn't believe what he said. The room looked like it was originally made to hold people against their will. However, they were still unable to link him to the disappearance of the Sierra as well as to her whereabouts. But everything changed the third day after she disappeared. During a lengthy search, the police found a freshly dug grave in one of the fields that contained Sierra's body. She was handcuffed and had a large plastic toy in her mouth. She was also wearing an adult diaper. Medical experts have established that the victim died of strangulation. However, they have not been able to establish even an approximate time of death. In addition, they found no signs of violence. Around the same time, OSU actively examined all the evidence collected in James' shed. They found female DNA on one of the duct tapes lying next to the mattress, and it matched Sierra's DNA. The policeman also got a geolocation on James' smartphone. Turns out the night the girl disappeared, he spent almost 2 hours near that place. They got another disturbing piece of evidence from the psychologist that James was arraigned for his previous abduction. According to him, during one of the sessions, James stated that he learns from his mistakes with each new abduction, and next time, he's gonna bury the bodies. Apparently, the psychologist decided not to report such alarming statements to the police and did so only after he was accused of murder. With this kind of evidence, the detectives have formed the most likely timeline. Apparently, that evening, James spotted the Sierra on the road, hit her with his helmet, and dragged her into the field with her bike. Based on his geolocation, the man was there until the sun went down. During this time, he called his brother and said that his motorcycle had broken down. Apparently, this was his way of creating an alibi. As soon as it got dark outside, James drove home, hopped a motorcycle to a van, went back to the field, picked up the Sierra, and took her to his shed. At the time, she was either unconscious or shackled. James was the only one who knew what was going on. Apparently, he abused the victim for a while, then killed her and buried her in a field. The experts only assumed that the victim could have been there all 3 days. The man himself continued to deny all these charges, and the case was brought to court. The trial began in March 2018. The prosecution provided additional evidence that further pointed to his guilt. Turns out the key to the handcuffs the victim was wearing was found on James' keychain. His lawyers decided to stick to the theory that James just wanted to set up an adult film studio in his shed, and the cops pushed it to murder. However, they never provided any adequate argument for their client's innocence. The trial ended in less than a month, and on 28 March, a jury found him guilty. James was sentenced to death. The execution is scheduled for May 20, 2025. Of course, for detectives, this story was far from over. Given what they found out about this man, the police were certain that James had committed similar crimes before, but he managed to avoid accountability. Investigators are still working his case, trying to connect the unsolved disappearances to James, but no concrete results have been found yet. The parents of the victim had established a Sierra scholarship and had also been involved in the creation of a law under which the state would make a public registry of people previously convicted of murder and kidnapping. The bill was quickly supported and came into force on 20 March 2019. Share your opinion in the comments, and do not forget to like under this video if you liked it under this video. I also recommend subscribing to my channel, where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thank you for watching. A young girl who worked part-time at a restaurant on a school break got out of work, and disappeared without a trace. The following days, his story began to turn into shocking details and unexpected twists. When the truth became known, even seasoned detectives were in for a real shock. After all, none of them faced with such horror. Friends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like, it's very important to me. Lisa Marie Gray was born on July 11, 1983, in Dawes, Mississippi. The girl was cheerful and active, constantly participating in the activities of her school and singing in the choir. She was also active in the local church. At school, Lisa decided that she wanted to become a primary school teacher and had previously chosen the college where she planned to study for the profession. In the summer of 2000, when she was 16, she also took a part-time job at a restaurant owned by her uncle. The girl liked this job. It was simple enough, but it allowed her to save money for the future. Another advantage was that the restaurant was just over a kilometer from her home. It was also a small town where the vast majority of the inhabitants knew each other. So Lisa actually worked in a circle of acquaintances. On June 22, the girl had to finish her shift at the restaurant at 11:30 p.m. She got home by car, and it was only a few minutes, but her parents never waited for her daughter that night. Sometime later, her mom decided to call one of her employees. She admitted that Lisa might have stayed at the restaurant to chat with friends. The woman contacted the cook, who said that Lisa had left a few minutes before him. The man added one interesting detail. As he was driving from the restaurant after his shift at the side of the road, there was a car near the restaurant with an alarm on. Given that it was already dark outside, the man didn't get a good look at the car. However, after calling Lisa's mother, he speculated that the car may have been hers and promised the woman to turn around and drive to check it out. The car was only a few hundred meters from the restaurant. The cook went back to that spot and saw the car still standing there with the accident on, and the man recognized Lisa's car. The girl herself was not inside, which seemed strange to him. Then the cook decided to drive to her parents' house, where he told about his find. They got even more worried and decided to go to that place with the chef. They were looking at the car and noticed at once several disturbing points. First, the car had a flat tire. Apparently, Lisa discovered this shortly after she left the restaurant and stopped by the side of the road. Secondly, the car doors were unlocked and Lisa's purse and phone were inside. All this made parents think that something bad might have happened to their daughter. Realizing that her car had a flat tire, she could have walked home and to the restaurant in minutes, but she didn't. Moreover, she did not call relatives who could have come and helped her with the problem. As a result, the parents decided to go to the police, and the investigators immediately began to look for her. The first thing they did was to interview all the staff at the restaurant and those who visited the restaurant that day. The restaurant was located in a small town, and most of its visitors were familiar to the staff. The officers immediately told the police that on that day, one of all the clients stood out. A man named Thomas Lawton used to go there twice in the morning and just before closing. The remarkable thing was that both times the man came in different cars. The first time he was in an old car, and the second was in a van. In addition, the cook told the police something else interesting. According to him, Lawton actively tried to flirt with Lisa, despite being 35 years old and the girl 16. The restaurant staff knew this man. He grew up indoors, later went to the army, and to this day was a recruiter there. The day before, the man returned to the city to visit his grandmother, and investigators decided to talk to him. They went to the house where his grandmother lived. The woman herself slept at the time, and the police opened her sister, who lived with her in the same house. She said that Thomas was already asleep. Given that it was a deep night, the investigators decided to talk to him the next day. Before he left, one of the cops spotted a van near the house. He matched the description of the car that Lawton used to drive to the restaurant before closing. However, this fact did not mention anything. The investigators are gone. Lisa remained incommunicado throughout the night, her whereabouts unknown. By morning, the police had begun interviewing all the visitors to the restaurant, but with no significant result. They decided to return to Granny Lawton's house. The woman opened the door to them and said that Thomas had gone fishing by the pond, which was at the edge of her property. The investigators asked the woman to go there to ask the man some questions. She agreed, but Thomas wasn't there. This seemed strange to them, and the police approached his grandmother again. This time, they asked permission to inspect her house, and the woman again agreed. Thomas wasn't inside either, but investigators found something interesting. When they entered his room, they saw some t-shirts that appeared to be stained with blood. Another disturbing find was waiting for them in the car that Thomas had been seen driving near the restaurant for the first time. There was a rope tied so that it looked like handcuffs. It was all very suspicious. The police immediately requested a court order for a full search. Immediately afterwards, they began a more detailed search of the house and also sent Lawton's van to the experts for examination. However, the whereabouts of Thomas himself remained unknown, and the police issued a search warrant for him. By the evening of the same day, they were told that the man had been found, and the detectives were expecting a very unexpected surprise. Lawton was found lying on the side of the road with an inscription. "I'm sorry about the carving on his chest." The man also had multiple wounds on his wrists. He was immediately taken to the hospital, and the investigators rushed there. During a conversation with the police, Thomas said that he did not know Lisa and had no idea where she was. Almost at the same time, the experts began to examine his van, and there was again a shocking twist waiting for everyone. They found the body of Lisa Gray under the convertible seat. The girl was not wearing any clothes, and her hands and legs were tied. From the marks on her neck, the experts immediately concluded that she was strangled to death. A video camera with a cassette tape was also found inside the car, which shocked the detective. The tape records Thomas abusing Lisa and bullying her. This recording was interrupted several times, and in the last part, it was seen that Lisa was already dead. Despite this, the perpetrator continued to abuse her, and for some time on the tape, it was also visible that Lawton was using the object that the experts found in his van during the abuse. They found the DNA of the man and his victim. The man was immediately arrested and taken into custody after leaving the hospital. He continued to deny his guilt while investigators searched the grounds of his grandmother's house for additional evidence. 18 meters from the house, behind a thick layer of bushes and trees, they found a newly dug grave with a shovel sticking out of it. Apparently Lawton was gonna bury the victim's body there, but he didn't have time to do it. With all this evidence, including video footage, the police were prepared to take the case to court. Thomas continued to deny his guilt, but things changed a few days later. After his arrest, he was temporarily imprisoned, and his wife came to him. Lawton was married to her for several years, and they had a 2-year-old child. During the conversation, the man told her that he wanted to confess everything. After her departure, he contacted the police. During this conversation, Thomas admitted that he had abused the victim. However, he added that he did not remember killing her. Rather, the man admitted that he had probably done so, but could not say precisely. According to his story, that night he saw Lisa on the side of the road, stopped and offered to help change the tire. While talking to her, the man mentioned that he was in the Marines. After that, he asked the girl if she had ever planned to go there, but Lisa said she wasn't even considering it, and she has other plans for the future. Thomas was enraged by this response, and then acted in a fit of rage. The man forced the girl to get into his van and drive to his grandmother's house. That's where Thomas parked it, and over the next 4 hours, he subjected the victim to violence, recording what was happening on camera. After Thomas killed her, he hid the body under the seat and returned to his grandmother's house, where he went to bed quietly. The next morning, he went to the overgrown area behind the house and prepared the grave. At the same time, Thomas could not clearly explain why he had carved the phrase "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry" had inflicted wounds on his chest, and why he had inflicted wounds on his wrist. Investigators questioned the veracity of some key details of his story. They assumed that Lawton had planned to attack Lisa beforehand. After he saw the girl and tried to flirt with her, he arrived at the restaurant just before closing and ordered a burger to go. He could have damaged Lisa's tire and waited for her to go home. After the girl stopped on the side of the road, Thomas was able to attack her and force her to get in the van. Several facts supported this version. First, experts found the tires of a punctured wheel with a sharp object. It was with his help that Lawton could pierce the wheel. Secondly, the investigators found a handcuffed rope in a car in which the man had come to the restaurant for the first time. It suggested that Lawton might have planned to kidnap someone before he met Lisa. The police did not fully understand why Lawton confessed, but misrepresented some of the facts. However, the evidence and his confession were sufficient to bring the case to court. The man was provided with lawyers who immediately requested that the trial be moved to another district. Given that every Dorse resident knew Lisa's family and followed the case, they feared bias. Thomas initially decided to plead not guilty, but 3 weeks before the trial, the man pleaded guilty to all charges. In so doing, he automatically waived the jury's decision, leaving his punishment entirely to the judge. Moreover, if convicted, Lawton could only receive the death penalty. The trial began on 8 October 2001. Lawton apologized to the victims' relatives and asked his lawyers not to challenge any of the prosecutor's arguments or even to try to provide extenuating circumstances. Given that he was facing the death penalty, the judge was surprised by this behavior. However, Lawton insisted that he was aware of the consequences of his decisions. Moreover, the man even stated that he wanted the death penalty, not a life sentence. However, his lawyers did try to press for pity and claimed that Thomas had a very traumatized psyche. In their view, he had been subjected to repeated violence as a child, and his service in hot spots had aggravated his injuries. According to lawyers, all of this had a direct impact on what Lawton did to Lisa. They brought in a medical examiner who said Lawton may not have been aware of what he had done. However, the prosecutor also called for an expert to refute the allegations. He concluded that the suspect had fully understood the gravity of his actions and had committed them of his own free will. Lawyers also pointed out that Thomas had never broken the law before and served in the Marine Corps for 18 years, but none of this helped get the sentence reduced. Given the fact that the man confessed to the crime, as well as an impressive body of evidence, the trial was completed in less than a month. Thomas Lawton was sentenced to death and 30 years in prison. The prison term was to be independent of the first sentence, and the death penalty could be imposed at any time without waiting for the offender to serve the full 30 years. Almost immediately afterwards, Thomas suddenly changed his position and tried to challenge the verdict. He filed appeals in which his lawyers sought to cling to any possibility of achieving this goal. At first, they said that Lawton was not fully aware of what he was doing, confessing what he had done. Lawyers then challenged the legality of the searches of his grandmother's house, as well as the receipt of all evidence. All these appeals were, however, dismissed as they were without merit. Since then, Lawton has filed numerous complaints in which he wrote that he did not receive proper legal protection in court, given that he himself had instructed his lawyers not to try to exonerate him. These attempts also failed. Thomas continued to create various appeals over the years. In the United States, it is often decades between the imposition of the death penalty and its execution, and Lawton did not spend that time in prison until 21 years after sentencing. The execution took place on 14 December 2022. Thomas, who was 58 years old at the time, last apologized to Lisa's mother, who came to watch the execution. Before his execution, Lawton ordered a final dinner consisting of pork chops, sweet baked potatoes, peach pie, and French vanilla ice cream. Lisa's mom said she found it in her to move on and forgive the criminal. Nevertheless, she believed his execution should have been carried out. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and be sure to like it under this clip if you like it under this clip. I also recommend you to subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching,